light seeped through the blinds in a hesitant, thin stream, and I awoke to the soft crackle of a tape recording. My eyes fluttered open, and confusion set in as I realized the sound was coming from a small, dusty tape recorder on the nightstand. My groggy brain struggled to make sense of it as I sat up and rubbed the sleep from my eyes. The tape was old, the kind with a reel that clicked and hissed with every turn. I stared at it for a moment, perplexed. I didn't remember recording anything, and I certainly didn't recall owning a tape recorder. The sound of my own voice filled the room, crisp and clear despite the graininess of the recording. My throat tightened with unease as I strained to understand the words. "First, you need to be sure no one's watching," my voice said calmly, methodically. "Approach the house from the back. The side door is usually unlocked. Enter quietly and head straight to the basement." I froze, the blood draining from my face. I never remembered saying any of this, and the deliberate tone in my voice was disconcerting. I reached over and stopped the tape, but the damage was already done. I could still hear the chilling monotone echoing in my mind. With trembling hands, I rewound the tape and played it again, hoping it might make more sense the second time. It didn't. My voice continued to list detailed instructions about a house I didn't recognize and a crime I didn't remember committing. My heart raced as I pulled the tape from the recorder. It was dated from a few nights ago, a time when I had been asleep in my bed, or so I thought. Panic set in as I recalled my recent behavior. I had been working long hours, staying late at the office, and barely keeping track of my own life. But I was certain I'd never been involved in anything criminal. The recording had described breaking and entering, and though the details were vague, they included steps to avoid detection. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. The house, the methods, it all seemed so foreign yet oddly familiar, as if I was subconsciously connected to it. I had to figure out what was going on. My first thought was to contact the police, but the notion of being implicated in a crime I didn't remember committing was terrifying. What if the tape was a setup? Or worse, what if someone was manipulating my memory? I decided to investigate on my own. The house mentioned in the recording was located in a quiet, suburban neighborhood about 30 minutes away. I drove there with a mix of dread and determination, my mind racing with questions. What was I supposed to find? What if someone had framed me? When I arrived, the house was exactly as described: 2 stories, red brick, with an old-fashioned side door. My nerves were on edge as I approached cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of recent activity. The door was indeed unlocked, just as my voice had instructed. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, and the air smelled of dust and disuse. I followed the directions from the tape, moving slowly towards the basement. The steps creaked under my weight, adding to the growing sense of foreboding. The basement door was ajar, and a sliver of light from the stairwell revealed a dark, cluttered space below. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, trying to ignore the rapid thumping of my heart. Gathering my courage, I descended into the basement. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old, forgotten items, boxes, faded furniture, and stacks of papers. I shone my flashlight around, hoping to find something that would explain the recording. Then I saw a small metal box tucked away in a corner. It was locked, but a key was lying beside it. I picked it up, hands trembling, and unlocked the box. Inside were several items: a photo album, a set of keys, and a small notebook. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the notebook. It was filled with handwritten notes, many of them detailing similar steps and plans as those on the tape. I flipped through the notebook, feeling a mix of dread and curiosity. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the content was disturbingly precise. The notes included details of various crimes, break-ins, thefts, and burglaries. The last entry was dated the night before the tape recording. As I read through the pages, I noticed something even more unsettling: sketches of my own house and office, as if someone had been tracking my every move. A cold realization hit me: someone had been observing me, manipulating my actions. I was jolted out of my thoughts by the sound of approaching footsteps. My heart raced as I quickly gathered the items and shoved them back into the box, then turned off my flashlight. I hid behind a stack of old furniture, trying to steady my breathing. The footsteps grew louder, and a shadow moved across the dim light. Whoever was in the house knew I was there. My mind raced with possible scenarios. Was this a trap? Had I been led here for a reason? The footsteps continued, moving around the basement, and then they stopped. The room was silent once more. I waited for what felt like an eternity before carefully making my way back to the stairs. I had to get out of there and figure out my next move. As I emerged from the house, I glanced back one last time, the weight of the tape and the notebook heavy on my mind. I drove away, my thoughts a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I knew I had to find out who was behind this, but the danger felt very real. The recording had been just the beginning, and now I was entangled in a mystery far darker than I had ever imagined. Story 2. For weeks, my life had been shrouded in an eerie fog of uncertainty. It began subtly: strange notes left in my mailbox, cryptic messages scrawled on the bathroom mirror in my apartment. At first, I dismissed it as pranks or the figments of a stressed mind. But as the weeks dragged on, the threats escalated in severity and frequency. Each message seemed more sinister than the last, until the fear became an ever-present companion. I was living in a state of constant vigilance, scanning my surroundings with paranoia and barely sleeping. The words in the notes varied. Some were vague and menacing, others were explicit in their threats. They seemed to know my routines, my habits, and even my small personal quirks. The messages would appear when I least expected them: at my front door, on my car windshield, or hidden in a book one was reading. The persistent fear began to gnaw at my sanity. I tried to involve the authorities, but their efforts seemed minimal and often dismissive. Probably just a prank, they would say, or you're not in any immediate danger. I wanted to believe them, but the growing pile of threats said otherwise. Each note was a chilling reminder that someone was watching. Someone knew things about me that they shouldn't. The most unsettling part was the feeling of being followed. I would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. After weeks of sleepless nights and mounting anxiety, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I spent countless hours poring over the threats, trying to discern patterns, clues, or any hint of who might be behind this relentless harassment. It was during one of these late-night sessions that I noticed a pattern. The messages, while varied in their content, had one thing in common. They all contained subtle references to recent events in my life, details that seemed innocuous but hinted at a disturbing level of observation. Determined to confront this unknown tormentor, I set up a series of cameras around my apartment and meticulously tracked the times when the threats appeared. I even hired a private investigator, but his findings were largely inconclusive, leading him to conclude that I was the target of an elaborate hoax. Frustration and fear were my constant companions as the days stretched into weeks. Finally, after an excruciatingly long build-up, I managed to identify the source of the threats. It was someone I knew, someone who had been in my social circle for years: Jake, a former colleague from a job I had left several months prior. His name was a cold stab of recognition when I pieced together the final clues. The discovery left me numb. Jake had always seemed like a harmless, somewhat aloof individual. To think he was behind the threats was both shocking and unnervingly plausible. I arranged to meet Jake at a secluded coffee shop, hoping to confront him privately. As I approached, my nerves were taut with anxiety. I scanned the area, half expecting an ambush or some further twist in this nightmarish ordeal. But Jake was there, looking casual and almost relieved to see me. "Hey, it's been a while," he said, his voice oddly composed. "Cut the crap, Jake," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "I know you've been behind the threats." His face betrayed no emotion. He motioned for me to sit down. "I know you're upset, but I had to make sure you understood just how much I know about you." As the conversation unfolded, I realized the true extent of Jake's invasion. He had been tracking me for far longer than I ever imagined. He knew not only about the routine parts of my life, but also about my deepest fears and insecurities. He had hacked into my personal devices, monitored my social media, and even used information from my friends and family to craft his messages. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Jake had been orchestrating a psychological game designed to make me question my own sanity. But it wasn't just about threats, Jake explained with a disturbing calmness. "I needed you to be aware of how vulnerable you are. You were too complacent, too trusting. I wanted to show you that anyone can be watched, that privacy is an illusion." The coldness in his eyes sent shivers down my spine. His words were laced with a twisted sense of purpose, a rationalization for his despicable behavior. He seemed to take a perverse pride in his ability to manipulate and control from the shadows. "I don't understand why you did this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What did you hope to achieve?" Jake leaned in closer, his gaze unwavering. "It's not about what I hope to achieve. It's about what you need to understand. You're not as safe as you think. No one is." The conversation ended with him walking away, leaving me to grapple with the enormity of his actions. The threats ceased after that encounter, but the psychological scars remained. I found it impossible to return to my previous sense of normalcy. The invasion of my privacy, the manipulation, and the cruelty of it all left me with a profound sense of distrust. As I walked back to my apartment, the familiar surroundings felt alien and threatening. The knowledge that someone had been watching me, orchestrating fear, and violating my sense of security was a burden I would carry with me for a long time. It wasn't just about the threats anymore, it was about the profound realization that my life had been a stage for someone else's dark play. Story 3. I had been working as a caretaker for Mrs. Eleanor Hughes for almost a year. She was a formidable woman in her late 70s, living alone in a grand Victorian house at the edge of town. Despite her advanced age, her sharp eyes and quick wit remained intact. Her family had long since passed away, and she had no friends or acquaintances who visited. My role was to ensure she took her medication, helped her with meals, and provided companionship, though she was often content with her own company. Mrs. Hughes was an enigmatic figure, deeply private. She rarely spoke about her past, and her house was filled with antiquities and artifacts that seemed to have no apparent connection to her. Her wealth was undeniable, evident in the elegant furnishings and the grand piano that sat unused in the parlor. Most of our conversations revolved around her memories of the past, snippets of which she occasionally shared with me, though they were always veiled in ambiguity. One humid afternoon, as the sun filtered through the dusty lace curtains, Mrs. Hughes took her usual afternoon nap. I took the opportunity to tidy up her attic, a place that had been untouched for years. The attic was a labyrinth of old trunks, faded photographs, and cobwebbed corners. As I moved a particularly heavy steamer trunk to vacuum beneath it, I felt a slight give in the floorboards. My curiosity piqued. I set the trunk aside and began to pry up the loose boards. Beneath them, I found a narrow staircase leading down to a hidden room. My heart raced as I descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The hidden room was small, lit only by a single, dusty bulb. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and what I saw made my stomach churn. The walls were lined with photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. The photographs were of people I didn't recognize, though some were of me. I approached one wall, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The photographs were all of me at various points in my life. There were snapshots of me walking to my car, laughing with friends, and even a few taken through the window of my own apartment. Each photograph was meticulously labeled with dates and locations. The notes, written in a spidery handwriting, described my life with unnerving precision. They included details about my childhood, my hobbies, and even my most intimate fears and aspirations. My hands trembled as I picked up one of the notes. It described a moment I had shared only with my closest confidant, my sister, Emily. The note detailed a conversation we'd had about a traumatic event from our childhood, something I had never spoken of outside our family. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. How could Mrs. Hughes know these things? How could she have collected this information? I scoured the room, desperate for answers. On a small desk in the corner, there was a diary. I flipped through its pages, each entry meticulously dated and written with the same unsettling precision as the notes on the walls. The diary chronicled not only Mrs. Hughes's life, but also detailed her obsession with me. It revealed how she had been following me, gathering information, and documenting every detail of my existence. The final entry was the most chilling. It described Mrs. Hughes's plan to reconnect with me in a way that was deeply unsettling. Her words were cryptic, but hinted at some form of grand design or experiment. She mentioned that I was central to her final project, though the nature of this project remained vague and foreboding. I stumbled back up the stairs, my mind racing. The house, which had always felt like a stately but benign relic of the past, now seemed menacing. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow seemed to take on a new, sinister meaning. I needed to get out of there, but as I turned to leave, I heard Mrs. Hughes's voice calling from upstairs. She must have woken up from her nap. Panic surged through me, and I quickly replaced the floorboards and repositioned the trunk. I fled up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, and I met Mrs. Hughes in the hallway, forcing a smile as I greeted her. For the rest of the day, I was on edge, trying to act normal while my mind reeled from what I had discovered. The knowledge that someone had been watching me so closely, documenting my every move, was deeply unsettling. I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer, but I also knew I needed to tread carefully. If Mrs. Hughes was as manipulative and controlling as her notes suggested, she might react unpredictably. That evening I called the authorities, providing them with a detailed account of what I had found. They arrived and conducted a thorough search of the hidden room, but when they questioned Mrs. Hughes, she maintained her calm demeanor, insisting that the room was a personal project she had abandoned years ago. They found no concrete evidence linking her to any nefarious activities beyond her unusual obsession with my life. The investigation closed with little resolution, and Mrs. Hughes's behavior remained unchanged. I left the job, unable to shake the feeling of being watched and the eerie knowledge of what lay hidden in that room. The experience had changed me irrevocably, leaving me wary and distrustful. The memory of those photographs and notes lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of the dark, hidden corners of the human psyche and the unsettling ways in which our lives can intersect with the unknown. Story 4. The gas station was quiet that night, the hum of the neon lights casting a cold glow over the deserted forecourt. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, the seconds stretching into what felt like an eternity. I worked the late shift alone, a routine that usually gave me time to catch up on reading or daydream about something other than the monotony of filling up tanks and ringing up snacks. It was around midnight when he walked in. The man was a regular, someone I'd seen almost every night for the past few months. At first, I had thought of him as just another face in the crowd of late-night drivers. He always wore a worn leather jacket and had a grizzled beard that spoke of long hours on the road. His truck was old but meticulously kept, a pristine example of a classic model that seemed out of place among the modern vehicles. Initially, his visits were innocuous. He'd come in for gas, buy a coffee, and engage in small talk about the weather or traffic conditions. Over time, though, his interactions grew more personal. He would ask about my plans for the weekend or my thoughts on various local events. His questions were always innocent enough, but they began to seem oddly probing. At first, I shrugged it off as friendly curiosity, the kind of idle chatter that one might expect from a regular customer. But that night, something shifted. The way he looked at me as he walked in felt different. His gaze seemed to linger a little too long, his eyes tracking me as if I were a puzzle he was determined to solve. He stepped up to the counter and placed a large soda and a pack of cigarettes in front of me. As I rang up his items, he started his usual small talk, but there was an edge to his voice that made me uncomfortable. "Been working late a lot lately," he said, leaning on the counter with an air of casual familiarity that didn't quite match his words. "You don't mind, do you, working these hours?" I forced a smile. "It's fine. Just part of the job." He nodded, but there was something unsettling in his gaze, a way he seemed to be dissecting every word I said. I handed him his change, trying to ignore the knot tightening in my stomach. As the minutes passed, his behavior grew increasingly strange. He began asking questions about my family, questions I had never heard before. "How's your brother doing? Still studying at the university?" He asked, though I had never mentioned having a brother, or any family, for that matter. The questions were so precise that they made me wonder if he had been keeping track of details I never shared. "Do you think you'll stay in town after your shift ends?" he continued, his voice smooth but laced with an undertone of something darker. The way he phrased the questions made me uneasy. I answered as vaguely as possible, but the sense of being scrutinized never left me. The final straw came when he began talking about my personal life in a way that was far too intimate. "I've noticed you have a lot of books at home," he said, as if he'd somehow been peering into my apartment. "Do you like to read before bed?" My heart pounded in my chest. I don't know how you know that," I stammered, my fingers fumbling with the cash register. "I'm sorry, but I really need to get back to work." He seemed to sense my growing discomfort. His smile didn't waver, but his eyes took on a hard, unsettling glint. "Just making conversation," he said, his tone smooth but with a cold edge. "It's a small town. People talk. They notice things." The shift felt interminable after that. I kept glancing at the security cameras, hoping to see something, anything that would reassure me that I was safe. The station was still as quiet as ever, but my sense of unease grew with every passing minute. At around 2 a.m., the man finally left, but his departure did little to ease my anxiety. I found myself glancing out the window every few minutes, checking for the sight of his truck pulling back into the lot. Every creak of the building or rustle of the wind made me jump. It felt as if I were being watched, even when I couldn't see anyone. When my shift finally ended, I walked to my car with a heightened sense of alertness. The parking lot was empty, save for a few scattered leaves blowing across the pavement. I started my car and drove home, my mind racing with thoughts of the man's unsettling behavior. It wasn't until I was safely inside my apartment, locked and bolted, that I allowed myself to breathe a little easier. I spent the rest of the night in a state of anxious vigilance, checking and rechecking the locks on every door and window. The feeling of being watched lingered, a gnawing presence in the back of my mind that refused to go away. The next day, I filed a report with the local police, detailing the man's behavior and expressing my concerns. They promised to look into it, but I was left with a gnawing sense of unease that refused to fade. That night, I was filled with dread as I prepared for my shift again. The gas station, once a place of routine and familiarity, now felt like a potential trap. The man's seemingly benign interest in my personal life had taken on a darker edge, one that left me constantly looking over my shoulder and questioning whether I was truly safe. And so, the gas station became a place of fear, where the lines between routine and danger blurred, and where the innocent facade of a regular customer had masked a far more sinister reality. Story 5. It began on a chilly autumn morning, when the first crisp hints of fall were beginning to touch the air. I remember opening my mailbox with a familiar routine, the sound of crunching leaves beneath my feet, and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Among the usual assortment of bills and junk mail, there was an envelope. It was plain, unmarked, and addressed to me in an elegant, old-fashioned script. The lack of any return address or identifying marks made it stand out, and curiosity quickly overpowered any rational hesitation. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, the texture of which was surprisingly high quality, almost luxurious. The letter inside was written in a neat, formal hand, with a tone that was both intimate and unsettling. The writer addressed me by name and spoke with a level of familiarity that was both intrusive and alarmingly precise. They knew things about me that I had never shared with anyone. At first it was small details, things like the exact way I liked my coffee in the morning and my routine of jogging in the park every weekend. It mentioned my favorite cafe, where I liked to spend my afternoons writing. The letter described my apartment's layout with an accuracy that made my skin crawl. It was as if the writer had been watching me for years, piecing together every fragment of my daily existence. The letter ended with a cryptic line, "I hope you enjoy the little surprises I have in store." In the days that followed, the letters continued to arrive. Each one was more detailed and personal than the last. They spoke of moments I had considered private, like the time I had a heated argument with my best friend at a local diner, or the week I had been dealing with a particularly difficult project at work. The writer seemed to know everything, the mundane and the profound. The content of these letters began to shift from mere observation to something more sinister. One day the letter mentioned seeing me through my living room window while I was watching a late-night movie. It described the movie's plot in detail, how I had been wrapped in my favorite blanket, and even the specific snacks I was munching on. I had never noticed anyone observing me from outside, but the description felt too accurate to dismiss as a coincidence. By now I was deeply unsettled. I changed my routine, started taking different routes to work, and even avoided certain places I frequented. But the letters still came. They became more intrusive, referencing conversations I had with friends and family, noting how my behavior had changed recently. One particularly disturbing letter included a sketch of my apartment's layout, complete with a detailed drawing of my living room, including the exact arrangement of furniture. Fear started to seep into my daily life. I installed additional locks on my doors, set up cameras, and even hired a security service to patrol my building. Despite these precautions, the letters kept coming. I began to feel as if I was living in a constant state of surveillance. Each new letter seemed to taunt me with the knowledge that no matter what changes I made, the writer was always one step ahead. Desperation led me to contact the authorities. I showed them the letters, hoping for some assistance in tracking down the sender. They took the situation seriously and began an investigation, but they had little to go on. The handwriting was meticulously crafted to avoid any identifiable characteristics, and the paper used was untraceable. The envelopes had no return addresses or other clues. As the weeks turned into months, the fear and paranoia started to take a toll on my mental health. I found it increasingly difficult to concentrate at work and even more challenging to maintain relationships with those around me. My friends and family tried to offer support, but the situation made it difficult for me to fully trust anyone. I became obsessed with the letters, analyzing each one for any hint of who might be behind them. Then, one day the letters stopped coming. I waited anxiously for weeks, but there was no sign of the mysterious correspondent. The silence was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. I had become so accustomed to the constant influx of unsettling information that the sudden lack of communication left me feeling off balance. Despite the cessation of the letters, the experience left a permanent mark on me. I remained wary of strangers and continued to be hyper-vigilant about my surroundings. The sense of being watched never fully dissipated, and my once normal routines became tinged with a lingering unease. Even in the safest of spaces, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, still knew far too much about me. I never discovered who was behind those letters or why they had targeted me. The investigation eventually went cold and the case remained unsolved, but the impact of those months has stayed with me. I am more cautious and more private now, forever changed by the unsettling knowledge that someone out there had an intimate, unnerving connection to my life. Story 6. In the remote rural clinic where I worked, life had settled into a predictable rhythm. The sun would rise over the dense forest that surrounded our modest building, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers over the uneven ground. By dusk, the clinic would quiet down, the staff retreating to their simple homes, and the nights would be filled with the serene sounds of nature. It was a peaceful existence, albeit isolated from the conveniences and excitement of city life. But this tranquility was shattered one night when a new patient arrived. I remember it clearly. The clock struck 10, and the faint creak of the clinic's door heralded the beginning of what would soon become a nightly ordeal. The man who entered was tall and gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his clothes tattered as if they had been through many storms. Despite his disheveled appearance, he carried an air of intense purpose. His symptoms were peculiar, a mix of physical and psychological distress. He would complain of relentless nausea, inexplicable dizziness, and the sensation of something crawling under his skin. Yet, his medical tests were inconclusive, showing no clear signs of infection or disease. I treated him with the standard remedies, but each night he returned with the same complaints, his symptoms growing ever stranger. Over the course of several nights, I began to notice a pattern. The man's visits would always coincide with a specific time a little past midnight. Each night, his symptoms seemed to intensify, and he would recount disturbing visions, shadows dancing at the edges of his vision, whispers that grew louder until they were unbearable, and a persistent feeling of being watched. One particularly cold night, I decided to stay late, curious about his late-night arrivals. The clock approached midnight, and true to form, the clinic door creaked open. I pretended to be engaged in paperwork, but my attention was fully on the man as he walked in. His eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and anticipation, and he took his usual seat. As he described his symptoms, his voice trembled with an urgency that was both desperate and desperate. "It's getting worse," he said, clutching his stomach as if trying to quell some unseen force. "I hear them whispering. They want something from me." I tried to reassure him, but the words felt hollow. I decided to discreetly observe him, noting the peculiar way he glanced around the room as if searching for something. My curiosity grew, and I found myself following him at a distance after he left the clinic. He walked swiftly through the dimly lit streets of the village, heading towards the dense forest that bordered our clinic. I trailed behind, careful not to make a sound. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind, creating eerie shadows that danced on the ground. He reached a small, dilapidated house on the outskirts of the village. It was barely more than a shack, overgrown with weeds and vines. The man entered through a side door, and I waited for a few moments before slipping inside. The interior was cluttered with strange artifacts, old books, jars of what looked like preserved specimens, and peculiar symbols scrawled on the walls. The air was thick with an unsettling odor, a mix of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place. I moved cautiously, peeking through a crack in a door at the back of the house. Inside, the man was sitting at a makeshift altar, surrounded by candles that flickered in the dim light. He chanted softly, his voice rising and falling in an incomprehensible rhythm. On the altar was a strange, dark object, covered in cryptic runes and emitting an almost imperceptible hum. My heart raced as I realized the man was performing some sort of ritual. The symbols on the object matched those I had seen on the walls. It became clear that his nightly visits to the clinic were not merely about seeking medical help, but were part of a larger, darker plan. As the ritual reached its climax, the air grew heavy with a palpable sense of dread. The man's face contorted with a mix of fear and determination, and I could see that the object on the altar was not just a trinket, it was something of significant power. I backed away slowly, not wanting to draw attention. Once outside, I made my way back to the clinic, my mind racing with the implications of what I had witnessed. The man's symptoms, the whispers, the ritual, it all pointed to something far beyond the realm of conventional medicine. The following night, I decided to take action. I contacted local authorities and shared my observations, though it was clear they were skeptical. They agreed to investigate, but were cautious, knowing the man had a right to privacy. As the days passed, the man's visits to the clinic ceased abruptly. The authorities found his shack abandoned, the ritualistic artifacts left behind in a state of disarray. The man had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the remnants of his dark practices. In the end, the mystery of the man and his nightly visits remained unsolved. The clinic returned to its quiet routine, but the memory of those eerie nights lingered. The forest continued to watch over the village, its shadows hiding secrets that perhaps were better left undisturbed. And as for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the balance of our world, a dark presence now lurking just beyond the edges of our understanding. Story 7. The warehouse had always been a fixture of the neighborhood, a hulking structure that loomed over the nearby houses like a relic from another era. Its walls were a tapestry of peeling paint and graffiti, and its windows were either boarded up or shattered, offering glimpses of darkness within. For years, it had been an enigma, an abandoned eyesore that most people avoided, assuming it was just another forgotten piece of industrial history. That changed one balmy August evening. I'd recently taken up a hobby of urban exploration, driven by a fascination with the hidden corners of my city. I was drawn to the warehouse by its air of mystery, the stories I'd heard about its past, and a nagging curiosity that had always lingered in the back of my mind. That evening, with a flashlight in hand and my phone's camera ready, I ventured inside. The main floor was a cavernous expanse of dust-covered machinery and broken crates. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. My footsteps echoed ominously as I walked, each sound amplifying the eerie silence. I made my way through the debris-strewn space, feeling like an intruder in a forgotten world. My exploration seemed relatively mundane until I noticed a narrow door partially concealed behind a stack of rotting pallets. Driven by a mix of curiosity and apprehension, I pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. I hesitated for a moment, the heavy air and the unknown depths below weighing on my conscience. But something in instinct, perhaps, compelled me to continue. I clicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as I descended the steps. The basement was a stark contrast to the cluttered main floor. It was clean, almost sterile, and the walls were lined with metal shelves and strange industrial equipment. The floor was concrete, stained in places with what looked like old oil or grime. As I ventured further in, My flashlight caught sight of something unsettling, a series of metal cages, the kind used for animals, but far too large to be anything other than sinister in their purpose. My heart pounded as I approached the cages. Inside them, there were remnants of what could only be described as personal belongings, discarded clothing, a child's toy, and most disturbingly, a collection of photographs pinned to a wall. Each photograph was a snapshot of despair faces of young women and children, their expressions a mix of fear and resignation. The realization of what these items implied began to sink in, chilling me to the core. I tried to steady my breathing as I carefully examined the area. There were documents scattered across a metal table in the corner. I flipped through them, my hands trembling. The papers were filled with names, dates, and addresses, information that seemed to document the lives of countless individuals. My mind raced as I pieced together the horrifying picture. This place wasn't just abandoned, it was a hideout for a human trafficking ring. The weight of the discovery was suffocating. I could hardly believe what I was seeing, and yet every piece of evidence confirmed the grim reality. I knew I had to get out of there and report what I'd found, but panic and dread clouded my thoughts. I took one last look around, hoping I hadn't missed anything crucial, and then hurried back up the stairs, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Emerging into the fading light of the evening, I was met with a flood of relief and urgency. My first call was to the local authorities. I provided as many details as I could about the location and the disturbing evidence I had uncovered. The dispatcher's voice was steady, but I could sense the seriousness of the situation as she assured me that officers would be dispatched immediately. I stayed nearby, hidden in the shadows as I waited for the police to arrive. The minutes felt like hours, each second stretching into an eternity as I grappled with the enormity of what I had discovered. When the first patrol car finally pulled up, I approached them, explaining everything once again. The officers listened intently, their expressions growing more grave as I described the basement and the evidence I had found. Within minutes, the warehouse was swarming with police, detectives, and forensic teams. The scene was cordoned off, and I was interviewed further as they began their investigation. They seemed to be taking my account seriously, and I was given assurances that the evidence I had provided would be thoroughly examined. The aftermath of the discovery was a whirlwind of activity. News outlets picked up the story, and the once abandoned warehouse became the focus of intense scrutiny. The neighborhood was stunned by the revelation, the very notion of such horrors being hidden in their midst causing a deep sense of betrayal and fear. In the days that followed, it became clear that the authorities were taking significant steps to dismantle the trafficking ring that had operated out of the warehouse. Arrests were made, and the investigation revealed a network of individuals involved in the illicit operation. The community was left to grapple with the knowledge that such darkness had been lurking so close to home. For me, the experience was both harrowing and haunting. The memory of those photographs in the cages still lingered in my mind, a stark reminder of the suffering that had occurred. Yet, there was also a sense of relief, knowing that my actions had contributed to bringing some measure of justice. The warehouse, once a symbol of neglect, had become a beacon for change, illuminating the urgent need to address the horrors of human trafficking and ensuring that such atrocities could never again be hidden in the shadows of the forgotten places around us. Story 8. At first, it seemed like fate had a hand in my love life. My online dating profile had attracted someone who, on paper, seemed perfect. Their messages were thoughtful and engaging, their profile pictures looked like scenes from a romantic comedy, and their hobbies matched almost eerily with mine. They were polite and charming, and their attention to detail in our conversations made me feel like I was the only person they had eyes for. We had been chatting for a few weeks, and while I'd felt a slight tug of caution, the intensity of their interest was flattering. They remembered the small details I'd mentioned in passing, like my favorite coffee shop and the book one been meaning to read. Their attentiveness made me believe they were genuinely invested in getting to know me. It was flattering at first, and I found myself looking forward to our conversations. However, there was a growing sense of discomfort that I couldn't shake. They started asking questions about my schedule, my daily routines, and the people in my life. I tried to brush off my unease, convincing myself that they were just eager to connect. But the more they asked, the more I felt like I was being put under a microscope. Then one evening, after a particularly intense conversation about our dreams and aspirations, I came home from work to find something that made my heart drop. My front door was slightly ajar. My first thought was that I might have forgotten to lock it properly, but a cold wave of anxiety washed over me as I slowly pushed the door open. Inside, the apartment was silent, but the sense of invasion was palpable. I had a habit of leaving my keys on the kitchen counter, but they were missing. I scanned the room frantically, my mind racing through all the possibilities. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I noticed a small note on the kitchen table. It was written in neat, precise handwriting. I've been waiting for this moment. I wanted to surprise you and show you how much I care. Panic set in as I read the note, and my hands trembled. My phone was still in my purse, which was on the sofa. I grabbed it and dialed 911, barely able to form coherent words. The operator's calm voice did little to quell my rising terror as I explained the situation. They assured me that officers were on their way. While waiting for the police, I searched the apartment for any signs of the intruder. I noticed a few personal items out of place. A framed photo of my family was turned face down, and a book one had left on my nightstand was now on the living room floor. It was as though someone had been through every inch of my home, examining it with a meticulous eye. The arrival of the police brought a sense of temporary relief. They conducted a thorough search of the apartment and questioned me about what I had seen and heard. I mentioned my online admirer, and their interest was immediately piqued. They took note of the details I shared, especially the parts about the admirer's excessive attentiveness and the strange questions they had been asking. It turned out that my online admirer had been more than just a persistent message sender. They had been tracking my every move. I discovered later that they had followed me to the coffee shop I frequented and even visited the bookstore I had mentioned in passing. The realization that they had been so closely monitoring my life was terrifying. The police took the note and promised to investigate further. They advised me to be cautious and to consider changing my locks and enhancing my security system. I agreed, my mind still reeling from the violation of my personal space. In the days that followed, I found it difficult to return to any sense of normalcy. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a place of fear and anxiety. I kept the lights on at all times, and I found myself jumping at every sound. I didn't even want to check my phone, fearing that another unsettling message might be waiting for me. I decided to temporarily stay with a friend while I had my security system upgraded and my locks changed. My friend was supportive and did their best to distract me from the fear that had taken root. Still, the experience left me shaken, and the trust I had once extended to online connections felt irreparably damaged. The investigation into my admirer's activities continued. The police were able to trace some of their digital footprints, but the individuals seemed to have vanished into the ether, making it difficult to apprehend them. I was left with a haunting sense of uncertainty about whether they would resurface or if they had already moved on to another target. I learned a hard lesson about the importance of protecting personal information and being cautious with online interactions. While I eventually resumed dating, I did so with a new level of vigilance and a heightened sense of self-protection. The experience had changed me, and I was determined to ensure that my boundaries were respected and my safety prioritized. In the end, my obsessive admirer faded into a distant memory, but the scars of their intrusion remained. I hope that sharing my story might help others recognize the warning signs and take steps to safeguard themselves. The internet can be a wonderful place for connection, but it's crucial to remember that not everyone who reaches out has good intentions. Story 9. It had been just a week since I walked through the grand glass doors of Titan Technologies, a company renowned for its cutting-edge innovations and legendary work culture. The excitement of joining such a prestigious firm had been palpable, and the orientation had painted a picture of an ideal workplace where creativity and collaboration flourished. Yet, as I settled into my new office, a disquieting discovery began to unravel. My office was situated on the 12th floor, a space bathed in natural light with a panoramic view of the city's skyline. The walls were adorned with modern artwork, and the furniture was sleek and ergonomic. Everything seemed perfect, right down to the subtle hum of the air conditioning and the soft rustling of papers. I had been given a warm welcome by my team, and for the first few days, everything seemed to be going smoothly. It was during an unusually quiet afternoon when I first noticed something amiss. I had been reviewing some project files on my desk when I heard a faint, irregular clicking sound. Initially, I attributed it to the building's HVAC system, or perhaps the distant clatter of office workers' keyboards. But the clicking persisted, growing slightly louder as the day wore on. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began to investigate. I started by checking the usual suspects: loose floor tiles, the back of my desk, and even the ceiling tiles. The noise was persistent but elusive. After a thorough but fruitless search, I sat back down, dismissing the sound as an odd but harmless quirk of the building's infrastructure. It wasn't until the next day, when I was rearranging some files, that my sense of unease deepened. Beneath a stack of old reports, I discovered a small, inconspicuous panel in the wall. It was slightly ajar, and I could see a sliver of what appeared to be a hidden compartment behind it. The clicking sound intensified as I approached it, and I felt a chill run down my spine. With a mix of apprehension and determination, I pried open the panel. Behind it was a tiny, concealed room, scarcely large enough to fit a person. Inside, there were several devices that looked like a mix between old-fashioned surveillance equipment and modern gadgets. Cameras, small and discreet, were mounted on the walls, their lenses barely visible. Alongside them were various recording devices, each meticulously labeled with dates and times. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My heart raced as I sifted through the clutter of equipment, finding files detailing my daily activities. There were notes about my meetings, observations of my work habits, and even mundane details like the time I took my coffee breaks. The files were organized with alarming precision, each entry time-stamped and categorized. The realization hit me hard. I was being watched. Every action I took since I started at Titan Technologies was documented. The shock was almost too much to process. I felt a growing sense of paranoia had my every move been scrutinized from the moment I stepped into this office. The sense of being under constant surveillance was suffocating. I knew I had to act cautiously. Confronting this situation recklessly could have severe repercussions. My first step was to gather evidence. I took photos of the hidden cameras and the files, making sure not to disturb the setup too much. I then carefully closed the panel and replaced the items as they were, hoping to avoid drawing any suspicion. My mind raced as I pondered my next move. Who had installed these cameras and why? Titan Technologies prided itself on innovation and integrity. Could this be some sort of misguided security measure or an elaborate experiment in monitoring employee performance? I decided to speak with someone I trusted. My immediate supervisor, Sarah, had been supportive and seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being during our interactions. I approached her the next morning, framing my concerns around privacy and office security without revealing the full extent of my discovery. Her reaction was one of genuine concern, but she was evasive about the specifics of office surveillance policies. Sarah promised to look into it, but her assurances did little to quell my anxiety. The days that followed were marked by an increasing sense of paranoia. Every conversation felt like it was being monitored, every decision scrutinized. I began to second-guess my actions, wondering if someone was judging my every move. As I continued to investigate discreetly, I learned from other employees that Titan Technologies had recently undergone a major restructuring. The company had implemented new protocols aimed at improving efficiency and security, but the specifics were kept vague. It seemed plausible that the surveillance could be part of this broader initiative, though the extent of monitoring I had discovered was far beyond what I had expected. The breakthrough came when I stumbled upon an internal memo that mentioned enhanced employee observation as part of a new performance management system. The memo was buried in a pile of paperwork in a public area, but it contained enough information to confirm my suspicions. The company had indeed installed surveillance systems under the guise of ensuring productivity and security. Armed with this information, I decided to confront the HR department directly. I scheduled a meeting with Mr. Collins, the head of HR, and presented my concerns along with the evidence I had gathered. His reaction was a mix of surprise and defensiveness. He acknowledged that surveillance measures had been implemented but insisted they were intended to ensure security and improve work processes. Mr. Collins assured me that the data collected was used in aggregate form and not to single out individuals. Nonetheless, the invasion of privacy I had experienced was unsettling. I left the meeting with a sense of cautious relief, but still felt the lingering effects of being watched so closely. The situation gradually settled into a new normal. Titan Technologies maintained its commitment to innovation, but I became more aware of the fine line between security and privacy. My experience had transformed my perception of the workplace, leaving me more vigilant and conscious of the boundaries between professional monitoring and personal privacy. The experience had taught me an invaluable lesson about the importance of transparency and the potential costs of an overly invasive approach to workplace security. Story 10. Meg. When Ella first set foot in the old, abandoned house, she was prepared for the usual grime and neglect that came with properties left to decay. Dust hung like a ghostly shroud over every surface, and cobwebs draped the corners like faded lace. The creak of the floorboards was an ever-present soundtrack as she made her way through the labyrinth of rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. The house was a relic from a bygone era, with ornate woodwork and Victorian charms struggling beneath layers of dust and decay. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and must. It was a challenging job, but Ella had dealt with worse. Little did she know, this job would be unlike any other. In the attic, Ella discovered a peculiar wooden trunk, its surface encrusted with grime and age. It sat incongruously amidst the detritus of forgotten times-old trunks, yellowed newspapers, and faded photographs. Curiosity piqued, she pried open the trunk with a crowbar, revealing its contents to be an assortment of letters, old clothes, and a leather-bound journal. The journal was exquisite, with a worn but intricately tooled cover. Ella's fingers brushed over the faded gold embossing that read Alexander Whitaker in elaborate script. Intrigued, she carefully opened it. The pages were yellowed, but the ink remained legible, detailing the life of the journal's owner with a disturbing intensity. The entries began innocuously enough. Alexander Whitaker wrote of his mundane daily routines, his attempts at renovations, and his occasional social outings. He spoke of a quiet life in the house, a sanctuary away from the bustle of the city. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. The entries grew darker, revealing Whitaker's increasing obsession with the house. He wrote about hearing strange noises at night, scratching sounds and whispers carried on the wind. He described an unsettling feeling of being watched, a sensation that grew more intense with each passing day. The descriptions were vivid, almost feverish, painting a picture of a man unraveling under the strain of his own fears. One entry stood out for its eerie revelation. Whitaker wrote about discovering a hidden room behind a panel in the study. The room was small, containing nothing but a strange, ancient-looking mirror. He described the mirror as disturbingly pristine despite the decay surrounding it. The mirror's surface, he noted, seemed to ripple like water when touched, distorting the reflection in unsettling ways. Whitaker's fascination with the mirror grew into an obsession. He began spending hours staring into it, convinced it held secrets or answers to the mysterious disturbances he had been experiencing. As the journal's narrative progressed, Whitaker's mental state deteriorated further. He wrote of strange dreams where he was trapped in a labyrinth of mirrors, each one reflecting a version of himself that grew more grotesque and distorted. He documented his fear of losing his sanity, the paranoia that the mirror was not just reflecting his image but somehow feeding on his fears. The final entries were jarring. They described a series of events that grew increasingly erratic. Whitaker wrote about a figure he saw in the mirror, a shadowy, indistinct form that seemed to follow him, watching his every move. His writings became frantic, with scribbled notes in the margins and hurried scrawls that suggested a man on the brink of collapse. The last entry, dated just days before his disappearance, was nearly illegible, the words smeared with what appeared to be blood. It was a desperate plea for help, a cryptic message about needing to close the circle and escape the reflection. Ella read the final entry with a shiver. Whitaker's descent into madness was palpable, and the idea that the mirror might have been a conduit for his unraveling was unsettling. She glanced around the attic, her eyes falling on the trunk, now feeling like a grave marker of Whitaker's tragic story. She decided to investigate further. Descending to the study, she located the hidden panel Whitaker had described. With a mix of trepidation and curiosity, she pried it open and found the small room exactly as described. The mirror, however, was gone. The room was empty save for a dusty, old chair and a few scattered pieces of broken glass. The mirror's absence was a disappointment, but Ella couldn't shake the feeling that its influence was still lingering in the house. She left the room, feeling as though she had uncovered something profoundly unsettling yet incomplete. As Ella finished her work and prepared to leave, she felt a strange weight lift from her shoulders. The house was no longer just a job, it had become a haunting enigma. She handed the journal over to the authorities, hoping they might uncover more about Whitaker's fate, but she knew the answers might remain hidden. The house was left as it was, a silent sentinel to a mystery that seemed to seep into its very walls. Ella couldn't help but wonder if somewhere in its shadowy corners, the mirror still held its dark reflections, waiting for the next soul to gaze into its depths. Story 11. The old house was a relic from a bygone era, its creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper whispering tales of decades gone by. I'd moved into the upper room of this Victorian relic, eager to find a quiet place to focus on my studies. The landlady, Mrs. Whitaker, had seemed pleasant enough. Her soft voice and gentle smile were as comforting as the tea she served on my first visit, and her homey touches made the place feel welcoming. Her stories about the house's history, with its tales of past occupants and neighborhood gossip, painted a picture of warmth and charm. But as the weeks passed, the house's quaint exterior began to fray. It started subtly. Mrs. Whitaker had an uncanny ability to know exactly where I was at any given moment. One day, when I mentioned I had a late study session at the library, she seemed unusually surprised when I came home an hour later. Another time, when I mentioned a conversation with a friend about an upcoming exam, Mrs. Whitaker seemed to know every detail of that chat, despite my assurance that it was just a casual talk over coffee. I shrugged off these moments as coincidences or perhaps her just being unusually perceptive. After all, she was an elderly woman living alone in a sprawling old house. Maybe she had nothing better to do than keep tabs on her tenants. It wasn't until I came across the hidden camera that the unsettling truth began to unravel. I had been in the midst of rearranging my room, sorting through old textbooks and organizing my desk when I noticed something odd. Behind a loose panel in the wall, tucked away in a small alcove, was a tiny black device with a lens. My heart pounded as I realized it was a camera. I had always thought the small, dark spot on the wall was just a discolored patch. Now it was clear that it was a cleverly disguised peephole. My hands trembled as I pulled out the camera and inspected it more closely. It had been connected to a recording device, which was also hidden behind the wall panel. The sight of it filled me with a cold dread. I quickly disconnected everything and tucked it away, my mind racing. Why would Mrs. Whitaker have a camera in my room? The invasion of privacy was a profound violation, and it was clear that she had been watching me without my consent. I knew I needed to confront her, but the thought of doing so filled me with anxiety. What if she had a plausible explanation? Or worse, what if she was dangerous? My mind spun with questions as I tried to piece together the implications. Was I the only one being watched? How many other tenants had fallen victim to this invasion of privacy? The next morning I confronted Mrs. Whitaker while she was in her kitchen, preparing her usual breakfast of tea and toast. I struggled to keep my voice steady as I presented the camera and recording device. Her face, initially flushed with surprise, turned ashen as she realized I had discovered her secret. "I don't understand," she stammered, her hands trembling. "I never meant for this to hurt anyone." I pressed her for an explanation, and as the words spilled out, I was met with a tangled web of justifications. Mrs. Whitaker admitted that she had installed the camera out of a misplaced sense of security. She had been robbed years ago and had become increasingly paranoid about the safety of her tenants. She had convinced herself that watching over them would keep her home safe, even if it meant crossing ethical boundaries. It was clear that she was driven by fear, but her actions had gone far beyond reasonable precautions. Despite her tearful pleas and explanations, the breach of trust was irrevocable. The sense of violation I felt was profound. Mrs. Whitaker's actions had not only invaded my privacy, but had also shaken the very foundation of the trust between landlord and tenant. It was difficult to reconcile the image of the kind, elderly landlady with that of someone who had so egregiously overstepped boundaries. In the days that followed, I decided to move out. I could no longer feel comfortable in a space where my privacy had been so blatantly compromised. The process of packing up my belongings was tinged with sadness and frustration. I had enjoyed living in the old house, but the sense of safety and security was gone, replaced by a lingering unease. I reported the incident to the appropriate authorities, who took the matter seriously. Mrs. Whitaker faced legal consequences for her actions, though I hoped that she would receive help to address her fears and compulsions. It was a painful process, but I knew it was necessary to ensure that no one else would be subjected to such an invasion. As I left the house for the last time, I glanced back at its imposing facade. The Victorian charm that had initially drawn me in now seemed tainted by the secrets it had harbored. I walked away with a mix of relief and melancholy, ready to start anew, but carrying with me the haunting reminder of how easily trust can be broken and how deeply it can affect one's sense of security. Story 12. The attic had always been a place of mystery in our old family home. Dusty boxes, cobwebbed corners, and the occasional creaking floorboard created an atmosphere of quiet suspense. So when I decided to sort through the old trunks and crates, I anticipated unearthing nothing more sinister than faded photographs and yellowed letters. Instead, what I found in a small, battered box buried beneath old linens was far more unsettling. The box was surprisingly heavy, its lid adorned with ornate brass hinges. It was coated in a thick layer of dust that clung to my fingers as I pried it open. Inside, nestled among a tangle of moth-eaten fabric and tarnished silverware, was a leather-bound diary. The cover was cracked and worn, the leather dry and brittle. My curiosity was piqued, but a sense of foreboding made me hesitate before I flipped it open. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. The handwriting was elegant, though shaky in places as if the writer had been both meticulous and anxious. I began to read, initially captivated by the personal details of my ancestors' lives, but it wasn't long before the entries took a darker turn. The diary belonged to someone named Lydia Ravenscroft, a name I had never encountered before in our family lore. Her entries started innocuously enough, detailing daily life and family matters, but as I delved deeper, the tone shifted dramatically. Lydia began writing about clandestine meetings held in the dead of night. Her words described gatherings of people shrouded in dark robes, whispering incantations in a language I could not recognize. These meetings, Lydia wrote, took place in a hidden room beneath the house, a place she had stumbled upon by accident. My heart raced as I read her description of the room, an underground chamber adorned with strange symbols etched into the stone walls. The diary detailed rituals performed in this chamber, rituals that seemed to involve the sacrifice of animals and the invocation of ancient entities. I could hardly believe what I was reading. The idea that my own family had been involved in such sinister practices was chilling. Lydia's entries grew increasingly frantic. She spoke of a growing sense of dread and the feeling that they were being watched by something far more malevolent than any mere human. The once detailed descriptions became fragmented, her handwriting erratic as she described her fear of the dark forces she felt were closing in on her. Her final entry was a desperate plea for help, written in a scrawl that suggested she was on the run. She wrote of a sense of impending doom, as if something terrible was about to happen. She mentioned a secret she had uncovered, something that could not be ignored, but the entry ended abruptly, leaving the secret unsaid. The diary had left me shaken, but it also ignited a fierce curiosity. I had to see this hidden room for myself. After hours of sifting through old documents and records in the house, I found a reference to a small door in the basement that had been sealed off years ago. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and anticipation as I pried the door open, revealing a narrow, musty staircase leading down into darkness. The air grew colder as I descended, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the stone corridor. I reached the bottom and found myself in a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were indeed covered in strange symbols, their meanings elusive, but their presence undeniable. In the center of the room stood an altar, its surface stained and worn, as if it had seen countless ceremonies. I examined the room closely, feeling a profound sense of unease. The atmosphere was thick with a lingering energy that made my skin crawl. It was clear that the rituals Lydia had described had been performed here, and the oppressive weight of their presence was almost tangible. In the far corner of the room, I discovered a hidden compartment beneath a loose stone. Inside, there were several old books bound in worn leather, their spines cracked and pages yellowed. They were filled with more disturbing accounts of rituals and incantations, some of which were too dark and incomprehensible to fully understand. As I was about to leave, I heard a sound behind me, a faint whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I turned, my heart racing, but the room remained empty. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. I fled the chamber, the sound of my footsteps echoing as I hurried up the stairs and back into the safety of the main house. Back in the attic, with the diary and the other books in hand, I felt a heavy sense of dread. The knowledge of the rituals performed by my ancestors was unsettling, but the feeling of being watched, of something dark lurking in the shadows, was even more disturbing. It was clear that the secrets of the Ravenscroft family were far darker than I had ever imagined. And though the diary had answered some questions, it had also raised many more, leaving me to wonder about the true nature of the forces my ancestors had dealt with, and what consequences their actions might have for me now. Story 13. The night shift at the old, sprawling warehouse was always a mix of boredom and anxiety. The place was massive, with darkened corners and echoing hallways that seemed to shift in the dark. I took the job as a night security guard more out of necessity than interest. The long hours in isolation suited me well enough. But everything changed one humid August night when I stumbled upon something that would shake the very foundation of my reality. It began as a typical shift. The only sounds were the distant hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the building settling into itself. I was making my routine rounds, flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The warehouse had been largely abandoned for years, a relic of a bygone era that was now more a ghost of its former self than a functioning facility. It was during my third round of the night that I first noticed something strange. In the narrow space between a stack of old crates and a rusty metal shelving unit, I found a small, dusty envelope wedged in a crack. I was about to discard it as litter when something made me pause. The envelope was old, yellowed with age, and the handwriting on the front was almost painfully neat. It bore no return address or name, only a single word written in block letters: watch. My curiosity got the better of me. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, covered in tight, meticulous handwriting. The note detailed a series of events that had occurred in the warehouse many years ago, events that I had never heard of before. It described an incident in which a group of workers had been trapped in a storage room, only to be found dead days later. The note detailed the exact layout of the room, the tools used to break in, and even the positions of the bodies. At first, I dismissed it as some sort of prank or a strange piece of creative writing, but the detailed descriptions and the chilling specificity of the information unsettled me. I folded the note carefully and placed it back in the envelope, tucking it into my pocket. Over the next few nights, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The notes became a nightly discovery, each one revealing more about the warehouse's grim history. They were hidden in places I would never have thought to look: under loose floorboards, inside hollowed-out wall panels, and even behind the old, decrepit vending machines in the break room. Each note was written with the same meticulous detail, outlining different events and individuals involved. One particularly eerie note described a man who had been seen pacing the halls late at night, claiming he had heard voices calling his name. The note mentioned the man's name, my own. My stomach churned as I read the words, realizing that the events described were strikingly similar to my own experiences since starting the job. Driven by a mix of fear and determination, I began to investigate the warehouse's history. My research revealed that the warehouse had been the site of numerous incidents over the years: accidents, disappearances, and even a fire that had claimed several lives. But none of the official records mentioned the specific details described in the notes. One night, I found a particularly ominous note hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. It described a secret passageway within the warehouse, suggesting that it led to a hidden chamber. The note ended with a chilling warning: find the truth before it finds you. My heart raced as I followed the instructions, pushing against the wall in the location described. To my surprise, a hidden door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dust-covered tunnel. The air inside was stale, and the passage seemed to stretch on forever. I hesitated only for a moment before stepping into the darkness. The tunnel led to a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with old photographs, documents, and other artifacts. The items on the shelves were disturbing photos of people I recognized from the notes, all looking terrified or in distress. The documents detailed their lives, their fears, and their final moments. At the center of the room was a large, wooden desk covered in more notes, all detailing my own life. They described my daily routines, my interactions with colleagues, and even personal details that no one else knew. It was as though the writer had been tracking my every move, recording my life with a precision that was both unsettling and intimate. As I sifted through the documents, a realization hit me with a jolt. The person who had been leaving these notes was not only aware of the warehouse's dark history, but seemed to be orchestrating events in a twisted, personal manner. The purpose of the notes, the hidden room, and the meticulous records all pointed to a deeper, more sinister plan. Before I could make sense of it all, the lights flickered and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. The sense of being watched grew overwhelming. My flashlight, which had been the only source of light, now flickered erratically. Panic set in, and I stumbled through the tunnel, back to the main warehouse. The notes stopped coming after that night. I never figured out who had been leaving them, or why they had chosen to fixate on me. The warehouse remained just as abandoned and desolate as before, but the shadows seemed to hold new, darker secrets. My shifts became shorter and less frequent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the warehouse had become a place where reality and nightmares intertwined. Story 14. When I first moved into the apartment on Elm Street, it felt like a fresh start. The building was old, with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper, but it had character. The landlord was a grizzled man with a kind smile who assured me that the apartment had been meticulously cleaned and inspected. I took his word for it, desperate for a place to call my own. The first few weeks were blissfully normal. I unpacked boxes, arranged my belongings, and made the space my own. However, as the weeks turned into months, I began to notice something strange. Little things, really scratches on the wall that seemed to have no reason to be there, a faint smell of mildew in the closet, and a peculiar chill that never quite went away. I dismissed these oddities as the quirks of an old building. One evening, as I was rearranging my storage closet, I discovered a hidden compartment behind a loose panel in the back corner. At first, it seemed like just another forgotten nook in the old apartment, but curiosity got the better of me. I pried it open and found a small, dusty box tucked inside. My heart skipped a beat when I saw that the box was locked, but the rusty old key that lay beside it seemed to fit perfectly. With a turn of the key, the box creaked open. Inside, I found a collection of old videotapes, each labeled with dates and names. There was a dusty old VCR on a shelf in the back of the closet, so I decided to see what was on these tapes. The idea of unearthing some forgotten history seemed oddly fascinating. I dusted off the VCR, plugged it in, and inserted the first tape. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy footage of a living room. The camera was positioned in a corner, capturing every detail of the room. At first, it seemed like an ordinary home video of family gathering, casual conversations, and the kind of everyday moments that people often record. But as I continued to watch, the footage took on a darker tone. The camera would linger on certain spots for longer than necessary, focusing on private conversations, personal interactions, and moments that should have remained unseen. The most disturbing part was that the tapes seemed to document every aspect of the previous tenants' lives, intimate moments, arguments, even quiet, mundane activities. The more I watched, the more unsettled I became. I saw footage of a young couple arguing fiercely in the living room, the camera zooming in on their faces with an unsettling, voyeuristic quality. Another tape showed a single woman in her bedroom, pacing anxiously while the camera captured every detail of her distressed state. It was clear that these recordings were not made with consent. They were an invasion of privacy, a sinister glimpse into the lives of those who had lived in the apartment before me. The realization hit me like a cold wave. The hidden compartment was not just a forgotten storage space, it was a secret repository of surveillance, a chilling reminder that someone had been watching these people. And now it seemed that I was the new subject of this intrusive gaze. I searched the apartment frantically for any other clues or hidden cameras. Every corner, every crevice, every shadow seemed to hold a potential secret. I found nothing, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I couldn't shake the sense that someone was still monitoring me, that the tapes were merely the tip of the iceberg. The landlord's reassuring words about the apartment's cleanliness and safety took on a new, unsettling light. Had he known about the hidden compartment? Was he involved in this invasion of privacy? Or was he just as much a victim of this twisted situation as I was? Sleep became elusive. I started to avoid the apartment as much as possible, spending nights at friends' houses and staying away during the day. I was afraid to be alone, afraid to return to a place that had become a source of dread and discomfort. I contacted the police, but without concrete evidence or a clear suspect, they could do little more than file a report and offer vague assurances. Days turned into weeks, and the sense of paranoia never fully left me. The apartment, once a symbol of independence and freedom, had become a prison of fear. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside felt like a reminder of the violation I had endured. In the end, I decided to move out. The decision was both a relief and a sadness, a relief to escape the clutches of an apartment that had become a symbol of violation and fear, and a sadness for the loss of a place that had promised a new beginning. I never found out who had made those tapes or why they had chosen to leave them behind. The landlord eventually disappeared, leaving no forwarding address or contact information. I left the apartment on Elm Street behind, but the memory of that hidden compartment and the unsettling footage would linger with me for a long time. It was a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones hidden in plain sight. Story 15. The shelter had always been a place of solace, a beacon of hope for those who found themselves without a roof over their heads. It was a place where people could come to escape the harshness of the streets, find a warm meal, and perhaps even some semblance of stability. I had volunteered there for nearly 2 years, drawn by the desire to help others and make a difference in a world that often felt indifferent. My routine was familiar: setting up cots, serving meals, and lending an empathetic ear to those who needed it most. But recently something had shifted. It started subtly. A few odd conversations here and there, fleeting mentions of peculiar encounters that seemed to stick out like a sore thumb. I brushed it off at first, attributing it to the rough and often tumultuous lives of the people we served. However, as the weeks went by, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. One evening, as I was sorting through donated clothes in the back room, I overheard a hushed conversation between 2 regulars, Tim and Joe. They were sitting on a pair of tattered armchairs near the coat rack, speaking in urgent whispers. The mention of a shadowy figure caught my attention, but as I approached, they quickly fell silent, casting uneasy glances in my direction. Curiosity gnawed at me, but I respected their privacy and didn't press them for details. Instead, I kept an ear open for any further clues. Over the next few days, more individuals began to share unsettling stories, though they were often fragmented and incoherent. There were mentions of strange people lurking around the shelter, observing from the corners, or approaching individuals under the guise of offering help. One afternoon, I found myself chatting with a young woman named Laura, who had recently begun coming to the shelter. She was jittery and spoke in a hurried, almost panicked tone. Her story was alarming. She claimed that someone had been following her, appearing in various places she frequented, and she was convinced that this person had sinister intentions. The details she provided were disturbingly specific, how they seemed to know where she would be at any given moment, how they seemed to be always just out of sight, but always present. Laura's story echoed what I had been hearing from others. There was a common thread, the unsettling presence of a figure who seemed to have an uncanny ability to track people's movements and anticipate their actions. It was as if someone was intentionally exploiting the vulnerability of those who sought refuge at the shelter. My concerns deepened, and I began to piece together the fragments of information that had been shared with me. It became increasingly clear that this wasn't just a random series of coincidences or the paranoia of those with troubled pasts. Something more sinister was at play. I decided to confront the shelter's director, Mark, about my observations. He was a kind-hearted man who had been running the shelter for years and had always been a source of strength for the staff and those who came through the doors. Mark listened intently as I described the unsettling stories I had heard and the patterns I had noticed. At first, Mark seemed skeptical, but as I presented the details and my own growing unease, he grew more concerned. We agreed that it was crucial to ensure the safety of the individuals at the shelter, and we decided to increase security measures. We started by installing additional cameras around the premises and hiring extra security personnel to monitor the area. It was a step towards safeguarding the shelter's guests, but it also felt like a temporary solution to a problem that was much deeper. The presence of the new security measures did little to ease the tension. The stories continued, and some individuals even claimed that the figure seemed to have become more brazen, as if the increased surveillance only fueled their need to remain hidden but active. It was an unnerving realization that the figure was operating with a disturbing level of skill and audacity. Months passed, and the pattern of sightings and stories persisted. Laura eventually left the shelter, disappearing as suddenly as she had arrived, and other individuals came and went, each carrying their own tales of unease. The shelter remained vigilant, but the shadowy figure remained elusive, their motives unclear and their identity unknown. Despite our efforts, the sinister presence that preyed on the vulnerable at the shelter was never fully uncovered. The stories faded, and life at the shelter went on, but the shadow of fear lingered. I continued my work, but the experience had left an indelible mark on me. It was a sobering reminder of the dangers that lurked even in places meant to offer refuge, and the haunting reality that not all threats are easily seen or understood. In the end, the shelter continued to be a haven for those in need, but the shadows of the past remained a silent witness to the darker corners of humanity. The figure who preyed on the vulnerable was never caught, but the vigilance and compassion of those who worked at the shelter ensured that, despite the darkness, there was still light to be found in the care and support given to those who sought it. Story 16. The remote clinic sat quietly under the vast, starlit sky, its modest structure blending seamlessly with the rural landscape. I had taken the position with the hope of making a difference in an underserved area, where medical care was a rare and cherished commodity. My days were filled with the usual routine, treating minor injuries, managing chronic conditions, and providing preventive care to the local population. But the nights were different. They brought a mystery I hadn't anticipated. The first sign that something was amiss was the arrival of a new patient. It was peculiar in itself. Patients in this area generally came during the day. Yet, night after night, someone new would appear at our doorstep. Their symptoms were always bizarre, and despite my best efforts, they defied explanation. One patient complained of severe headaches that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the moon. Another experienced intense bouts of disorientation, claiming to hear whispers in the walls. The symptoms varied, but each case had an unsettling similarity, an air of anxiety and urgency, coupled with a story that made less and less sense. The pattern of these visits led me to suspect that something was terribly wrong. Each new patient brought more than just their ailments. They brought a chill that seemed to seep into the very walls of the clinic. I began to document their symptoms meticulously, trying to find a common thread. But as the nights wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play. Then came the night when everything changed. I was alone in the clinic, the low hum of the fluorescent lights my only company. The waiting room was eerily quiet when the door creaked open, and in walked a figure cloaked in a heavy, dark coat. The figure was tall and slender, and their face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. They moved with a deliberate calmness that unsettled me. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "How can I help you tonight?" The figure took a seat and slowly removed the hat, revealing a pale face with hollow eyes. "I need your help," the patient said, their voice soft yet unnervingly steady. I took their information and started with the usual questions. They spoke of vague symptoms, dizziness, fatigue, and a persistent sense of dread. But as they spoke, their gaze never wavered from me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were studying me with an unnerving intensity. After examining them, I could find nothing physically wrong. I suggested they see a specialist, but they refused, insisting they felt better in the presence of the clinic. As they left, they handed me a slip of paper with a phone number scrawled in a shaky hand. "Call me if you need to understand," they said cryptically before disappearing into the night. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I hesitated only for a moment before dialing the number. But each time I tried, I was met with a dead line, static, or the occasional burst of distorted sound. Frustrated, I set the matter aside and returned to my work, hoping the peculiar visitor was just another case of rural eccentricity. Then the phone calls began. At first they were sporadic and brief, a few seconds of static followed by a faint, eerie voice. It wasn't until I began to hear snippets of conversations I'd had that the true horror of the situation set in. The voice on the other end seemed to know intimate details of my life, conversations I'd never shared with anyone outside my home. It was as though someone had been listening in on my private moments, piecing together snippets of my life into a twisted form of surveillance. I tried to trace the calls, but the number was always untraceable. The calls came at odd hours, sometimes in the dead of night, other times during the quiet moments of my shifts. Each call left me feeling more paranoid and isolated. The sense of being watched grew overwhelming, and I became increasingly paranoid. One night I decided to confront the issue head-on. As I sat by the phone waiting for the next call, I noticed a pattern. The calls always came after the clinic had received a visit from one of the strange patients. It was as if their presence was a precursor to the calls, and their departure triggered the surveillance. I began to connect the dots. Each patient seemed to have been watching me, subtly tracking my every move. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I realized that the last patient had left a subtle but ominous note in my patient records, cryptic symbols scrawled across it. Determined to uncover the truth, I went through the records of all the patients who had visited at night. I matched the symbols from the note to a series of documents in the local library, revealing a forgotten, ancient text about a group that believed in a form of spiritual surveillance, watching over individuals from the shadows and manipulating them through fear. The clinic was no longer a place of healing, but a center of an insidious experiment. The true identity and intentions of these nightly visitors became clear. They were not patients, but agents of an unknown entity, using fear and psychological manipulation as their tools. The sense of dread never left me as I worked through the nights, knowing that every strange occurrence was part of a larger, more sinister plan. I had become an unwilling participant in a disturbing ritual, and the isolation of the remote clinic made escape seem nearly impossible. Each night brought a new visitor, a new piece of the puzzle, and a new layer to the growing horror that had become my reality. Story 17. The road stretched out endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt flanked by vast, open fields and the occasional sleepy town. I had embarked on this road trip seeking a break from the monotonous hum of everyday life, craving the solitude and freedom that only a long drive could offer. The plan was simple: drive south until the cities and worries were behind me, revel in the unburdened journey, and return refreshed. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the road when I noticed a figure standing by the roadside, thumb extended, as I approached. There was something about the person that made me hesitate. They were tall and gaunt, with a weathered face partially obscured by a battered hat. Despite the late hour, something about them felt oddly compelling, and I found myself slowing the car. "Need a ride?" I asked, rolling down the window slightly. The hitchhiker gave a nod, eyes glinting with a mix of relief and something else I couldn't quite place. They slipped into the passenger seat with practiced ease, not saying a word at first. I glanced over as I started to drive again, noticing their worn leather jacket and the scuffed boots that seemed to tell their own story. "Thanks for picking me up," they said after a while, their voice gravelly but calm. I didn't think anyone would stop. "No problem," I replied. "Where are you headed?" The hitchhiker's response was immediate, almost too quick. "I'm actually going the same way you are. I saw you back there and thought I'd take my chances." A sense of unease crept over me. The coincidence seemed too perfect. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to the natural wariness of picking up strangers. "So, what's your destination?" I asked, attempting to make conversation. "Well, I've been following your route closely," they said, their eyes narrowing with an unsettling intensity. "I know you're heading to that small town near the coast, right?" My grip tightened on the steering wheel. How could they possibly know that? I hadn't mentioned my destination to anyone. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, that's right. How did you?" "Just a good guess," they interrupted smoothly, but the tone didn't fit with the supposed randomness of their answer. I stole a glance at the hitchhiker, noting their calm demeanor and the way they seemed to study me with unnerving precision. "What's your reason for going there?" The hitchhiker's face lit up with a smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. "I've got some business to attend to, just like you. We all have our reasons, don't we?" I couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation was veering into territory I wasn't comfortable with. Yet, I kept up the pretense of normalcy. "Yeah, I guess we do." As the miles ticked by, I began to notice that the hitchhiker seemed unusually knowledgeable about the local landmarks I planned to visit. They spoke with a familiarity that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the geography they seemed to know, it was the details of my trip, the rest stops I had planned to make, the routes I'd chosen. "Have you been to that diner on Route 7? They asked, leaning forward with interest. "Yeah, I'm planning to stop there tomorrow," I replied, trying to mask my discomfort. "Good choice. They have the best pie in the area, and that motel you're thinking of staying at has some interesting history." My heart raced. It felt as though the hitchhiker was more than just a casual traveler. "How do you know all this?" The hitchhiker chuckled softly, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Let's just say I've done my research. People like to talk when they think no one's listening." A knot tightened in my stomach. It was clear that their knowledge of my plans was not a coincidence. The realization hit me with the weight of a ton of bricks. This hitchhiker was not merely a traveler. They were someone with a deeper, more unsettling motive. I began to drive faster, hoping to put some distance between us. The hitchhiker's presence was a dark shadow in the passenger seat, their silence now oppressive. I couldn't focus on the road, the unease eating away at my concentration. "Something wrong?" the hitchhiker asked, their voice breaking the tense silence. "No, everything's fine," I forced myself to say, though my heart was pounding. The hitchhiker's gaze remained fixed on me. "You know I can help you with your plans if you want. I have a way of making things go smoothly." I didn't respond, my mind racing through potential scenarios. The hitchhiker's offer felt like a threat disguised as assistance. I needed to find a way to extricate myself from this situation. Finally, I spotted a small, well-lit rest area. I pulled in abruptly, the gravel crunching under the tires as I came to a halt. "This is where I need to stop," I said, trying to sound firm. "I think it's best if we part ways here." The hitchhiker smiled and wavered. "If you change your mind, just remember some paths are more dangerous than others." I watched as they stepped out of the car, their presence lingering like a bad dream. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My journey had been tainted by the unsettling encounter, and as I continued on, the shadow of that hitchhiker's chilling offer lingered with me, a reminder that sometimes what seems like a chance meeting can be something far more sinister. Story 18. When I first saw the apartment, I was instantly charmed. The vintage charm of its brick facade and the quaint garden out front seemed like something straight out of a storybook. The real estate agent had emphasized its character, and I was taken in by its cozy, inviting atmosphere. It felt like the perfect new beginning after a long period of uncertainty. The apartment was mine, and I was thrilled to finally have a space that was entirely my own. I settled in quickly, enjoying the process of decorating and making the space feel like home. The apartment was older, with creaky floors and a few quirks, but these were endearing, a testament to its history. Everything was going well until one rainy afternoon when I decided to explore the building's storage area in the basement. The basement was dimly lit, and the air smelled musty, but I felt a twinge of curiosity. The landlord had mentioned that the building had been around for decades, and I wondered what kinds of things might be stored away in the building's nooks and crannies. I wandered around, finding old furniture, forgotten boxes, and dust-covered knickknacks. It was all fairly unremarkable until something unusual caught my eye. In a corner, behind a stack of decrepit old chairs, was a small wooden chest. It was intricately carved with patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as though they were meant to convey some hidden meaning. The chest was locked, but the rusty old padlock fell open with little resistance when I tested it. Inside, I discovered a collection of manila folders, each one labeled with different names and dates. Intrigued, I pulled out the first folder and opened it. What I found inside made my heart skip a beat. The folder contained detailed documents about a previous tenant named Sarah Thompson. There were photocopies of her personal identification, notes about her job, and even a series of photographs documenting her daily activities. Some of the photos were benign Sarah walking her dog, shopping for groceries. But others were more unsettling shots of her entering and exiting her apartment, candid photos of her through windows. I shivered and quickly closed the folder, but my curiosity got the better of me. I opened the next folder, which contained similar materials for a man named Michael Green. His documents were even more disturbing. Along with his personal information and photographs, there were detailed notes on his habits and routines. There were references to his social interactions, snippets of conversations, and even strange diagrams that seemed to outline his daily movements around the city. The chest continued to reveal more folders, each documenting a new tenant with increasing detail. As I delved deeper, I noticed a pattern. The folders were not just documenting lives, but tracking their spirals into distress. One folder contained a series of frantic letters and scribbles from a tenant named Lisa Ward, who had apparently been plagued by strange occurrences and a sense of paranoia. Her final note was a desperate plea for help before she had vanished. The atmosphere in the basement grew heavier with each folder I examined. I began to notice a pattern that was both disturbing and eerily consistent. Each tenant had experienced increasing anxiety and eventually disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The folders seemed to be compiling evidence of a growing obsession, almost as though someone had been meticulously monitoring and manipulating these individuals. With trembling hands, I closed the chest and put everything back in its place. My mind was racing, and the basement, which had once seemed so intriguing, now felt like a sinister trap. I quickly made my way back to my apartment, locking the door behind me and trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The discovery weighed heavily on my mind over the next few days. I couldn't shake the feeling that the same obsessive presence that had meticulously documented the lives of previous tenants might still be lurking around. Every creak of the floorboards, every unexpected noise, seemed charged with ominous significance. I started to notice peculiar things about my surroundings, footsteps that didn't match the building's usual sounds, an occasional glimpse of someone in the corner of my eye, and a general sense of being watched. I decided to take precautions. I installed additional locks on my doors and set up security cameras around my apartment. I began to scrutinize my own routines, trying to be aware of my surroundings at all times. Despite my efforts, the unease persisted, and I felt like a puppet being watched by an unseen force. One evening, after a particularly unsettling day, I came home to find a note slipped under my door. It was written in a neat yet unfamiliar handwriting. The note read, "I hope you found what you were looking for. Your curiosity can be dangerous." The message sent a shiver down my spine. I had no idea who could have left it, but it was clear that someone was aware of my discovery. The creeping paranoia that had begun with the folders now transformed into a tangible fear. I knew I had to be careful, to remain vigilant, and avoid drawing attention to myself. The apartment that had once seemed like a charming new beginning now felt like a labyrinth of secrets and shadows. Each day I grappled with the knowledge that my new home was entangled in a disturbing history, and that I was now part of a story that I had never wanted to be part of. The feeling of being watched and the haunting realization that my curiosity might have uncovered something dangerous left me on edge, constantly questioning who or what might be lurking just out of sight. Story 19. When I first arrived in the small, secluded town of Hollow Creek, I was filled with a sense of excitement and trepidation. My university had tasked me with researching a project on the area's historical significance, but from the outset I could tell this wasn't going to be an ordinary assignment. The town's picturesque appearance masked an underlying unease that was almost palpable. Hollow Creek was quaint and seemingly charming, with its cobblestone streets, Victorian houses, and lush green meadows that stretched as far as the eye could see. But it was as if the town's beauty was a carefully maintained facade. The locals, though polite, were notably reserved, and their eyes always seemed to be watching me with a mix of curiosity and caution. My initial days were spent getting acquainted with the town's library, a small, dusty building that seemed almost too quiet. The librarian, Mrs. Hawkins, was an elderly woman with a stern demeanor and a surprising wealth of knowledge about the town's history. She provided me with a few old records and newspapers, but when I asked about more detailed archives or historical documents, her response was evasive. Determined to uncover the truth, I turned to other sources. I visited the local historical society, where the curator, Mr. Thompson, was more forthcoming but still hesitant. He seemed to avoid discussing certain periods in the town's history and directed me towards the more benign aspects of Hollow Creek's past. The more I pressed for information, the more he seemed to close up, his polite smile growing strained. Undeterred, I decided to delve into the town's oral history. I spent hours interviewing elderly residents, hoping to glean some forgotten details. The stories I heard were often disjointed and filled with strange gaps. There were mentions of a fire that had destroyed part of the town many years ago, but no one seemed willing to talk about who was responsible or why it had happened. I heard whispers of disappearances and strange occurrences, but each account was quickly hushed by nervous laughter or abrupt changes in topic. My breakthrough came when I stumbled upon an old journal in the attic of a crumbling house that had once belonged to one of the town's founding families. The journal was filled with meticulous entries detailing daily life and town events, but as I read further, the tone shifted. The writer began documenting bizarre and unsettling events, unexplained disappearances, unusual gatherings in the woods, and odd rituals that seemed to involve the entire community. One entry stood out, written in a hurried scrawl, "They are coming. The town knows more than they let on. We have to protect the secret. I fear for my life." The entry was dated just before the fire that had ravaged part of the town. This journal seemed to hint at a hidden truth, something that had been buried and protected at all costs. I began cross-referencing the journal's entries with historical records. What I discovered was chilling. The fire had been officially attributed to an accident, but the records I found mentioned several people who had disappeared around the same time, their names quietly erased from public memory. With mounting curiosity and anxiety, I decided to investigate the woods mentioned in the journal. Late one evening, I ventured out to the forest's edge, guided only by a flashlight and my growing sense of dread. The woods were dense and eerily silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves. I followed a narrow, overgrown path that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. As I walked, the trees appeared to close in around me, their gnarled branches casting twisted shadows. Eventually, I came upon a clearing that was disturbingly neat, with a series of concentric circles carved into the ground. At the center of the clearing was a large stone altar, covered in symbols and inscriptions that I couldn't decipher. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, and I felt an inexplicable chill. My heart raced as I took photos of the scene, my flashlight casting fleeting beams over the strange symbols. Just as I was about to leave, I heard footsteps approaching from the direction I had come. Panic surged through me, and I hurriedly made my way back to town, my mind racing with questions. The next day, I confronted Mrs. Hawkins and Mr. Thompson with my findings, showing them the photos and the journal entries. Their reactions were a mix of fear and resignation. Mrs. Hawkins's face grew ashen, and she spoke in hushed tones about a dark pact that had been made long ago, one that bound the town to secrecy and ensured their prosperity in exchange for unspeakable things. Mr. Thompson, though visibly shaken, confirmed that the town's history was carefully controlled and altered to protect these secrets. The gravity of the situation hit me hard. Hollow Creek was a town wrapped in layers of deception and hidden truths, its apparent serenity masking a history fraught with darkness. My research had unveiled only a fraction of the story, but it was enough to understand that the town's tranquility was maintained by concealing its more sinister past. I left Hollow Creek with a mixture of relief and sorrow, knowing that I had uncovered something profound yet deeply unsettling. The town remained a place of mystery, its residents bound by a secret that would likely remain buried, hidden in the shadows of history. Story 20. Volunteering at the local library was supposed to be a quiet reprieve from the chaos of everyday life. For Hannah, it was a chance to escape her hectic job and immerse herself in the comfort of books. The library was a charming, old building with creaky wooden floors and tall shelves filled with stories from every genre imaginable. The scent of aging paper and ink hung in the air, blending with the faint aroma of coffee from the staff room. One chilly afternoon, Hannah was tasked with reshelving a collection of donated books that had just arrived. She enjoyed the task. There was something soothing about arranging the books in their rightful places, rediscovering old titles, and occasionally finding hidden treasures among the donations. As she sorted through a particularly worn-out volume of classic literature, she noticed something peculiar. Scrawled in the margins of a page was a handwritten note, its ink smeared and faded. The note was not a typical library scribble but seemed deliberate and out of place. Curiosity piqued. Hannah turned the page to find more notes, each one written in a different hand but sharing a similar, unsettling tone. The notes described a series of bizarre events and hinted at a sinister plot involving certain patrons of the library. They were cryptic but clearly intentional, suggesting something nefarious happening within the library's walls. One note detailed an encounter with a mysterious figure who visited the library regularly, always wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. The writer described how this figure seemed to be conducting a secretive surveillance of other library patrons. Another note spoke of strange disappearances and hinted that the library was being used as a meeting place for a shadowy group with dark intentions. Intrigued and troubled, Hannah decided to investigate further. Over the next few weeks, she carefully examined every book she reshelved, discovering more notes hidden in various margins. The notes painted a chilling picture of paranoia and fear, describing clandestine meetings and cryptic codes. They often referred to a master plan that involved using the library as a front for something far more sinister. One note in particular caught her eye. It detailed a specific event and meeting scheduled for the following week in the library's basement. The note mentioned that the participants were to bring tools of the trade, and that the meeting would reveal the final stages of their plan. The mention of the basement was particularly alarming, as it was a rarely used part of the library, mostly forgotten, except for storage and a few dusty old archives. Hannah's heart raced as she read the note. The basement was off limits to patrons and only a few staff members had keys to the door. She decided she had to investigate this upcoming meeting. Using her position at the library, she made inquiries under the guise of routine maintenance checks and discovered that the basement was indeed scheduled to be accessed by a few staff members on the night mentioned in the note. As the night approached, Hannah prepared herself for what she hoped would be a revelation, not a disaster. She decided to stay late at the library, feigning work on some overdue tasks. As closing time came and the library emptied, she slipped into the basement, carefully avoiding the notice of the few remaining staff members. The basement was as musty and dimly lit as she remembered, with the only sounds being the occasional drip of water from an old pipe. Hannah hid behind a stack of boxes, her pulse quickening as she waited. Her eyes were drawn to the basement's entrance, where the light from the hallway slowly dimmed as the last of the staff members left. Hours passed in eerie silence. Hannah's nerves were on edge, and she was about to give up when she heard the faintest sound of footsteps. She peered around the corner and saw a group of people emerging from a concealed door at the far end of the basement. They were dressed in dark clothing and carried briefcases and bags that clinked ominously. Hannah watched in growing horror as the group set up a series of strange devices on tables. Strange symbols were sketched out, and odd tools were arranged methodically. The group members spoke in hushed, urgent tones, their faces partially obscured by shadows. The conversation was filled with references to the final phase and ensuring total control. Just as Hannah was about to take a closer look, one of the group members turned and seemed to glance directly in her direction. Panic surged through her, and she quickly retreated behind a stack of boxes. The group continued their preparations, seemingly unaware of her presence. Hannah's heart pounded as she quietly made her way back to the library's main area, her mind racing with fear and confusion. The next day, Hannah confided in the library's head librarian, revealing the disturbing notes and her findings from the basement. The librarian was initially skeptical, but agreed to investigate further. They contacted the authorities, who conducted a thorough search of the library and its basement. The investigation revealed nothing out of the ordinary: no hidden rooms, no strange devices, no secret meetings. Hannah felt both relieved and disheartened. The notes were gone and the basement had been cleared out. The library returned to its peaceful routine, but the experience left Hannah with a lingering sense of unease. She continued to volunteer at the library, but the shadows of the basement and the mystery of the notes haunted her thoughts. The library, once a sanctuary of quiet refuge, now felt like a place where secrets were hidden in plain sight. Story 21. It was an ordinary Tuesday when the package arrived. The day had been routine: attending classes, catching up with friends, and studying for upcoming exams. So when I found a plain, unmarked box sitting on my doorstep, it seemed out of place but not immediately alarming. My name was written in neat, block letters on the label, but there was no return address. Curiosity piqued. I carried the package inside, placing it on my kitchen counter as I made a mental note to investigate further. The box was small and surprisingly heavy for its size. I carefully removed the tape and opened it, revealing a stack of photographs and a few personal items wrapped in brown paper. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced at the top photograph. It was a picture of me, taken from a distance, walking across the campus quad with a friend. I hadn't noticed the photo being taken, and it was clear that the person who took it had been quite far away. I turned the photograph over, but there was no clue as to who had sent it. I dug deeper into the box and found more photos. Some were of me at various locations around town. Others captured moments that were intensely personal. One was of me sitting at a cafe, absorbed in a book. Another showed me at a park, laughing with a friend during a summer outing. Each photo was dated, with notes scribbled on the back detailing the times and places where the pictures were taken. It was as though someone had been following my every move, documenting my life with a meticulousness that was both unsettling and invasive. The collection included several personal items: a worn ticket stub from a concert I had attended months earlier, a receipt from a local bookstore where I had bought a book, and a small charm that had fallen off my bracelet a few weeks ago. My mind raced as I tried to understand how someone could have gathered such detailed information about my life without me noticing. I had never suspected that I was under surveillance, and the realization was chilling. My initial shock gave way to a growing sense of dread. Who could be behind this? And why? The items and photos seemed to suggest a level of obsession that I found deeply disturbing. I had always been careful about my privacy, so the idea that someone had been tracking me without my knowledge was profoundly unsettling. I decided to contact the authorities, hoping they could provide some guidance or assistance. An officer arrived to take the package and examine its contents. He listened attentively as I recounted the details, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern as he flipped through the photos and examined the personal items. "We'll look into this," he said reassuringly. "We'll need to analyze the photos and see if we can trace where they were taken. This is definitely troubling, but we'll do our best to find out who's responsible." While the police conducted their investigation, I found myself grappling with an ever-growing sense of paranoia. I started to notice things that I hadn't paid attention to before: unfamiliar cars parked outside my apartment, people who seemed to linger a little too long in the vicinity, and an eerie feeling that I was being watched. My daily routine, once a source of comfort, now felt like a series of risky maneuvers in a game I didn't want to play. In the meantime, I began to piece together the timeline and events captured in the photographs. I remembered the places and moments, but none of the photos had any distinctive landmarks or clues that could help identify the stalker. Each new discovery seemed to deepen the mystery and heighten my anxiety. The investigation progressed slowly, with few leads to follow. The police had difficulty tracing the origin of the photos and the items, which had been carefully anonymized. They reassured me that they were doing everything possible, but as days turned into weeks, the lack of progress only fueled my unease. Eventually, I decided to take steps to regain a sense of control over my life. I installed security cameras around my apartment, changed my daily routines, and became more vigilant about my surroundings. Though these measures offered some peace of mind, the fear of being watched never fully dissipated. I felt like a character in a thriller novel, constantly on edge, unable to predict when or where the next unsettling moment would occur. Then, one evening, as I was reviewing security footage, I noticed something unusual. A figure appeared near my building, loitering in the shadows. I couldn't make out any distinctive features, but the figure's movements were eerily familiar. My heart raced as I watched, my anxiety reaching a crescendo. I reported the sighting to the police, and they assured me they would investigate further. The following day, an officer informed me that they had made progress in identifying the individual. To my shock, the person under investigation was someone from my past, a former classmate who had shown an unsettling interest in me years ago. The revelation was both a relief and a source of profound discomfort. It seemed that my instincts about being watched had been justified, but the person behind it all was someone I had thought I'd left behind. The investigation continued, with the police focusing on gathering evidence and ensuring my safety. The experience had left me shaken, but it also strengthened my resolve to protect my privacy and personal space. The anonymous package, though distressing, had sparked a series of events that led to greater awareness and vigilance about my own security. As the case slowly moved toward resolution, I found solace in the support of friends and family who helped me navigate the emotional aftermath. The intrusion had tested my sense of safety and control, but it also highlighted the importance of staying alert and safeguarding one's personal boundaries. While I was still haunted by the shadows of the past, I hoped that the future would bring a renewed sense of normalcy and security. Story 22. The internship at St. Gregory's Hospital was supposed to be the culmination of years of grueling study, an opportunity to apply everything I had learned in medical school. The days were long and exhausting, but I found the work exhilarating. That was, until the day I stumbled upon something that would shake my faith in the institution I had devoted myself to. I had been assigned to the pathology department for a week, a stint that involved everything from observing autopsies to assisting with paperwork. The department was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, a sterile and clinical world where the living were seldom seen. One afternoon, while sorting through a stack of old case files that had been pushed to the back of a storage closet, I came across a folder that seemed out of place. Its cover was a dull gray, unlike the neatly labeled files that filled the room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully opened the folder. Inside, I found an autopsy report dated several months prior. It was not particularly unusual at first glance, an unsigned report with standard findings. However, as I read further, the details began to deviate from the norm. The cause of death was listed as undetermined, but the notes included observations that were anything but routine. The report detailed a series of deaths that appeared to share a disturbing commonality. The patients, all admitted under seemingly unrelated circumstances, had exhibited unusual symptoms before their deaths: profuse sweating, severe disorientation, and unexplained cardiac arrhythmias. The notes were meticulous, listing these symptoms in great detail, but the conclusions were evasive, often citing unknown factors or complications from underlying conditions without providing concrete explanations. What was most unsettling were the handwritten annotations in the margins. They were scribbled in a hurried scrawl, and their content was chilling. The notes hinted at a pattern that suggested these deaths were neither accidental nor due to natural causes. The terms like deliberate administration and possible external influence appeared frequently, alongside cryptic comments about cover-up and avoidance of public scrutiny. My heart raced as I pieced together the fragments. It was as if I had uncovered a hidden narrative beneath the surface of routine paperwork. The more I read, the more I became convinced that something deeply troubling was being concealed. I glanced around the empty office, my mind racing with questions. Why was this report buried among old files? And who could be behind the cover-up? Determined to dig deeper, I decided to investigate further. The hospital's records were digitized, so I accessed the electronic database and searched for additional reports related to the cases mentioned in the folder. To my dismay, I found that the digital records for those particular cases had been deleted. The digital trail had been wiped clean, leaving only the physical folder as a remnant of the truth. I knew I needed to proceed cautiously. If I was correct in my assumptions, then exposing this could have serious repercussions. I began to make discreet inquiries with colleagues, asking about any unusual cases or irregularities. My questions were met with polite but vague responses, and I sensed an underlying tension whenever the subject of the mysterious deaths came up. One evening, as I was leaving the hospital, I bumped into Dr. Martinez, the senior pathologist known for his strict adherence to protocol. I hesitated but decided to approach him. After some small talk, I broached the subject of the autopsy report I had found. His reaction was immediate, and telling his face paled, and he shifted uncomfortably. Sometimes we deal with cases that are sensitive, he said, choosing his words carefully. Not everything is as straightforward as we'd like it to be. I pressed him for more information, but he quickly excused himself, leaving me with a lingering sense of unease. It was clear that there was more to the story than I had uncovered. As days passed, I found myself increasingly obsessed with the mystery. I reviewed the report again and again, trying to understand what had really happened. Then, one night, while going over the notes once more, I noticed a pattern in the handwritten annotations. The references to external influence seemed to be pointing towards something specific. There was a recurring mention of a particular medication, one that was not commonly used but had been noted in several of the cases. I decided to investigate this medication further. My research led me to discover that it was a drug used in experimental treatments and had been linked to several adverse effects in clinical trials. Its administration required special authorization, and its use was highly regulated. The implications were alarming. It seemed possible that the drug was being used improperly, perhaps even maliciously, to induce symptoms that led to the deaths described in the report. As I was piecing together this information, I received a warning from an anonymous source, urging me to drop my investigation. The note was terse and menacing, hinting at consequences if I didn't comply. It was clear that someone was trying to intimidate me into silence. Despite the threat, I knew I couldn't back down. I had uncovered a serious issue that demanded attention. With a heavy heart and a deep sense of responsibility, I decided to bring the matter to the attention of a trusted mentor. It was a risk, but it was the only way to ensure that the truth would be exposed and that the lives lost would not be in vain. The mentor promised to investigate and take appropriate action. As for me, I faced an uncertain future, knowing that my career and personal safety might be at stake. But I took solace in the fact that I had done what I believed was right, even if it meant confronting powerful forces determined to keep their secrets hidden. Story 23. Managing a remote campground nestled deep in the forest was supposed to be a straightforward job. My role was simple: ensure that the grounds were maintained, that visitors adhered to the rules, and that everyone had a pleasant stay. The campground was secluded, surrounded by towering pines and a tranquil lake that drew in nature enthusiasts seeking solace from the chaos of the outside world. Yet, the job took a dark turn when I discovered a series of journals left behind by previous visitors. It all began on a crisp autumn morning. The campground had just closed for the season, and I was conducting a final check of the cabins and grounds before locking everything up for the winter. As I was cleaning out the last of the fire pits near Cabin 5, I found a leather-bound journal buried beneath a pile of fallen leaves. The journal was worn and weathered, its cover creased and faded. I picked it up with curiosity, flipping through its pages to find it filled with dense, scrawled handwriting. The entries began innocuously enough. The first few pages detailed the writer's excitement about their trip, the peacefulness of the forest, and their plans for hiking and fishing. The tone was cheerful, and the observations about the surrounding nature were typical of a camping enthusiast. But as I continued reading, the entries grew darker and more unsettling. One entry described a peculiar experience the writer had during a late-night walk. They mentioned hearing footsteps behind them, only to turn around and find nothing but empty darkness. The writer tried to brush it off as a figment of their imagination, but they noted an uneasy feeling that lingered. The next entry was even more disturbing. It detailed how, over the course of a few days, they had begun to see strange figures moving just beyond the tree line, figures that seemed to disappear whenever they tried to get a closer look. Intrigued and unnerved, I continued reading. The journal spanned several years, each one revealing a progressively more disturbing account of the campground's effect on its visitors. One entry described a group of campers who reported hearing eerie whispers and seeing shadows flitting between the trees at night. They claimed the whispers were not in any known language, but rather a collection of disjointed sounds that seemed to invade their minds. Another journal, dated several years earlier, was even more unsettling. The writer recounted a series of bizarre occurrences over the span of their stay. They had been woken multiple times by the sound of their tent zipping open, only to find nothing amiss. On one occasion, they described seeing a figure standing by the edge of the lake, illuminated by the moonlight. When they approached, the figure vanished, leaving only a strange, acrid smell in the air. The more I read, the more I began to notice a pattern in the accounts. Each journal seemed to follow a similar trajectory: initial excitement and enjoyment, followed by growing unease, and eventually an overwhelming sense of dread. The entries would end abruptly, often with the writer expressing fear and a desperate wish to leave the campground immediately. One journal, dated just a year prior, was particularly disturbing. The writer described an encounter with a local ranger who had given them a stern warning about the area. According to the journal, the ranger spoke in hushed tones about things that should remain undisturbed, and forces that dwell in the shadows. The writer dismissed the ranger's warnings as local folklore, but their own experience soon made them regret their skepticism. The final entry detailed how they had heard an agonized wail in the middle of the night, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the forest itself. As I read through the final journal, my unease grew. The entries became increasingly fragmented, filled with hurried scrawls and desperate pleas. The writer spoke of a growing sense of paranoia, feeling as though they were constantly being watched, and experiencing vivid nightmares that seemed to bleed into their waking life. The last entry was a single sentence written in frantic handwriting: "They're coming for me." The journals were disconcerting, but I tried to dismiss my growing anxiety as an overactive imagination. After all, the accounts were anecdotal, and there was no concrete evidence to suggest anything supernatural. Yet, as I finished cataloging the journals and prepared to lock up the campground for the season, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. The final days of my time at the campground were marked by a palpable sense of foreboding. Strange occurrences began to plague me. Items in the ranger station would be out of place. Footsteps echoed in the quiet woods, even when no one was around, and every rustle in the underbrush seemed to carry an ominous tone. The more I tried to ignore these feelings, the stronger they became. On my last night at the campground, I lay in my cabin, unable to sleep. The darkness outside seemed thicker than usual, the silence more profound. Every creak of the building and rustle of the leaves outside seemed amplified, and the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to rationalize the fear that gripped me. In the morning, I packed up and left the campground, locking the gate behind me with a sense of finality. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see something lurking in the trees. The campground faded from view, but the unsettling feeling remained, a lingering reminder of the strange and disturbing experiences of those who had come before me. The journals are now locked away in a secure storage unit, their stories a haunting reminder of the darkness that seemed to lurk just beyond the safety of the trees. Each time I think about the campground, I am reminded of the eerie accounts and the sense of dread that accompanied them. The forest remains silent, but I am left wondering if somewhere in its depths, the shadows still whisper their secrets to those who venture too close. Story 24. The community theater production of A Midsummer Night's Dream was meant to be a joyful escape from the mundanity of daily life. The cast, a mix of seasoned actors and enthusiastic newcomers, had been rehearsing for months. The camaraderie that developed among us was palpable. We shared laughter, frustration, and the collective thrill of creating something beautiful. It was supposed to be a collaborative effort, a celebration of creativity and friendship. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until the first performance, when I noticed something odd. During a particularly intense scene, a fellow actor, Derek, seemed unusually distracted. He was playing Demetrius, and his lines were slurred, his movements off. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming he was just nervous. But then, the same night, Miranda, one of our most reliable actresses, missed her cue and stumbled through her lines. Again, it was dismissed as opening night jitters. It wasn't until the second week of performances that the situation escalated. During a rehearsal, our director, Tom, received a disturbing phone call. He abruptly ended the rehearsal and gathered us in the green room. His face was pale and his hands shook as he explained that someone had threatened to release sensitive footage of the cast unless certain demands were met. The room erupted in confusion and panic. Footage? What footage? I asked, my voice barely concealing my alarm. Tom explained that someone had been secretly recording our rehearsals and performances. They had compiled footage of our most vulnerable moments, including private conversations and behind-the-scenes interactions. The blackmailer had made it clear that they knew personal secrets about the cast members and were using the footage to coerce Tom into specific demands. We were all rattled. This wasn't just a violation of our privacy, it was an attack on our very sense of trust and safety. The blackmailer had threatened to release the footage to the public if Tom didn't comply. The specifics of their demands were vague, but the implication was clear: our private lives were being used as leverage. The rehearsals took on a tense atmosphere. Every word we spoke and every interaction was now clouded by suspicion and fear. We tried to piece together who could be behind the blackmail, but the possibilities were overwhelming. The cast was diverse, with varied backgrounds and personal lives. Could it be someone among us, someone who had access to the recordings, or was it an outsider who had infiltrated our group? It was during one particularly grueling rehearsal that I made a startling discovery. As I was helping to clear up, I found a small, hidden camera tucked behind a prop in the wings of the stage. My heart raced as I realized that it was one of the devices used to record us. The camera was small, discreet, and clearly designed to be inconspicuous. I took it to Tom, and he immediately contacted the police. The investigation revealed that the recordings had been meticulously edited. The blackmailer had not only captured our private moments, but had also used the footage to craft a narrative that played on our insecurities and secrets. Each cast member's personal issues were exploited, and the threats were carefully calculated to cause maximum distress. As the days went by, the atmosphere became more charged. Accusations flew, and the unity we once had began to crumble. Miranda, usually so composed, was particularly affected. The footage had captured her having a private conversation about a sensitive family issue, and she was deeply distressed. Derek's struggles were laid bare as well, revealing personal struggles that he had tried to keep hidden. The police worked diligently, but the investigation was complicated by the fact that the recordings were anonymous. There were no obvious clues to the blackmailer's identity. The cast members were forced to confront their own vulnerabilities and the harsh reality that someone had exploited them for their own gain. In the midst of the turmoil, I took it upon myself to sift through the footage. I wanted to understand what had been recorded and how it had been used against us. I found myself immersed in a chilling collection of scenes, private conversations, personal struggles, and intimate moments that had been captured without consent. It was clear that the blackmailer had a deep understanding of the cast's personal lives, and they used that knowledge to manipulate and control. Eventually, the police were able to trace the recordings back to an individual who had been involved in the production as a stagehand. The person had been quietly observing the rehearsals and performances, gathering footage under the guise of routine technical work. They had used their position to access the cast's private moments and exploit them for financial gain. The revelation was both a relief and a blow. We had been betrayed by someone we had trusted, someone who had been a part of our community. The blackmailer was arrested, and the footage was secured, but the damage to our trust was profound. The production continued, but the camaraderie and trust that had once characterized the cast were irreparably altered. The experience left a lasting impact on all of us. We had been reminded of the fragility of trust and the potential for exploitation in even the most seemingly benign environments. The production was a success, but the memory of the blackmail and the invasion of privacy lingered long after the final curtain call. We learned to be more vigilant and to cherish the genuine connections we had, understanding that even the most secure environments could harbor hidden threats. Story 25. The first message arrived on a chilly autumn evening. I was curled up on my couch, sipping tea and flipping through the latest news on my phone when a notification popped up. The message was brief and cryptic: "Watch the leaves fall, change is coming." I dismissed it as a vague and oddly timed piece of spam. My day had been routine, and nothing about it suggested that a cryptic message could have any bearing on my life. A week later, the second message arrived. It read, "Tomorrow, the path you walk will diverge." I shrugged it off as a strange coincidence until the next day, when I encountered an unexpected fork in my usual route to work. I had been running late, and feeling unusually disoriented, I chose the less familiar path. That evening, I found myself involved in an unexpected and rather intense encounter with a colleague who had always been friendly but suddenly seemed to have issues with my work. The incident led to a tense meeting with my boss and an awkward reshuffling of responsibilities. It was a minor upheaval, but unsettling enough to make me question the message's eerie accuracy. The pattern continued. The messages became increasingly specific and foreboding. "Beware the shadows, they reveal the truth," one message warned. That day, I had an unsettling experience while walking home. As dusk fell, I noticed a figure trailing behind me, hidden by the darkness. The figure was never close enough to confront, but was always there, lurking just out of clear sight. It was a disquieting feeling, as if the message was somehow guiding me to a truth I wasn't yet ready to face. The messages became more precise. "Your trust will be betrayed," one read, and soon after, a close friend, whom I had always considered trustworthy, revealed they had been sharing personal details about me without my consent. The breach of trust was painful and left me questioning the intentions of those around me. Desperate for answers, I decided to investigate the source of these ominous messages. I scrutinized each one, looking for patterns or clues. The phone number from which the messages originated was untraceable, a mere string of numbers with no associated name or identity. The messages were always sent at times when significant changes or unsettling events occurred in my life. It felt as if someone or something was orchestrating these events to unsettle me. One evening, as I pored over the messages again, another arrived. "You are on the edge of discovery." The message coincided with an incident at work. I had stumbled upon a file that seemed oddly out of place and filled with detailed information about me, personal details, my daily routines, and even private moments. It was as if someone had been meticulously tracking my life. The realization was chilling. I started to connect the dots. The messages seemed to coincide with key moments when my life took unexpected turns, often leading to confusion or disruption. I wondered if someone was manipulating events to make me question my sanity or control my actions through a carefully orchestrated series of psychological games. Determined to uncover the truth, I enlisted the help of a private investigator. Together we dug into my life, trying to find any connection that could link these events and messages. The investigation revealed little at first. My acquaintances and colleagues were all seemingly innocent, and there was no clear pattern to the interference in my life. Then, one day, the messages stopped arriving. I had become accustomed to the cryptic notes, and their sudden absence left me feeling unsettled. I wondered if the person behind them had grown tired of their game, or if they had achieved their goal. The feeling of being watched, however, lingered. In the weeks that followed, I continued to experience odd coincidences and moments of unease, but they seemed to diminish in frequency and intensity. The private investigator suggested that the absence of messages might indicate a shift in the perpetrator's strategy or an end to their campaign. Despite the cessation of the messages, the impact on my life was lasting. I found myself more cautious and distrustful, often second-guessing the motives of those around me. The experience left me with a lingering sense of vulnerability and a heightened awareness of the potential for manipulation and deceit. The cryptic messages had left an indelible mark on my psyche, a reminder of how easily one's sense of reality can be distorted by unseen forces. The unsettling journey through orchestrated events and the revelation of hidden truths had taught me a valuable lesson about the fragility of trust and the complexities of human behavior. Life eventually returned to a semblance of normalcy, but I carried with me the awareness that even in the most ordinary moments there could be unseen currents guiding or distorting the reality we experience. The messages had been a harrowing reminder of the power of manipulation and the importance of vigilance in navigating the complexities of human interaction. Story 26. The psychiatric hospital where I worked was nestled on the outskirts of a small town, its imposing structure cast in eerie shadows by the dim light of street lamps. The night shift was always quiet, a time when the usual bustle of daytime activities gave way to an unsettling stillness. I was used to the monotony of these hours, checking on patients, monitoring their medications, and ensuring their safety. But one particular night, a routine check would lead me to uncover something that would forever change my perception of the facility. It all began with a faint noise. As I walked down the dimly lit corridor, the sound was almost imperceptible, like a muffled thud or the creaking of old wood. I followed the noise, leading me to a section of the hospital that was rarely visited. It was a part of the building that had been marked as under renovation for as long as I could remember. The door, which was always locked and marked with a "Do Not Enter" sign, was slightly ajar. A sliver of light seeped through the gap, casting an unusual glow on the corridor floor. Curiosity got the better of me, and I gently pushed the door open. The room beyond was a stark contrast to the sterile, clinical environment I was accustomed to. It was cluttered and dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying a faint, unpleasant odor. Dust-covered furniture and stacks of old papers were scattered about, creating an oppressive atmosphere. As I stepped further in, I noticed a large, metal filing cabinet against the far wall. It was old and rusted, its drawers partially open, revealing a disorganized array of files. I approached cautiously, the unsettling feeling in my stomach growing with each step. The files inside were marked with patient names and dates, but what struck me was the nature of the records. They contained detailed notes about experimental procedures and treatments that were anything but conventional. The more I read, the more horrified I became. The records detailed a series of experiments involving unapproved and unethical treatments, including sensory deprivation, extreme isolation, and drug-induced hallucinations. The notes were clinical but chillingly cold, with no regard for the well-being or consent of the patients involved. It was clear that these experiments were not meant to benefit the patients, but rather to satisfy some darker, undisclosed objective. Among the records was a dossier on a particular patient, someone who had been subjected to a variety of treatments over an extended period. The notes described disturbing observations, severe psychological distress, hallucinations, and an alarming rate of deterioration. The last entry was the most troubling, an indication that the patient had mysteriously disappeared from the hospital. As I sifted through the files, I came across photographs and handwritten logs documenting the experiments. The photographs were grotesque, showing patients in various states of distress, restrained and isolated in stark, clinical settings. The logs were filled with calculations and measurements, as if the patients were nothing more than lab rats in a twisted experiment. A sudden noise startled me, a door creaking open behind me. My heart raced as I quickly shut the drawer and turned around. Standing in the doorway was Dr. Miller, the head psychiatrist. His stern expression betrayed no hint of surprise, but I could sense an underlying tension. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with authority. I heard a noise, I stammered, trying to compose myself. "I didn't mean to intrude." Dr. Miller's eyes narrowed as he stepped into the room. "This area is off limits for a reason. These records are confidential." I wanted to protest, to demand answers, but the intensity in his gaze made me hesitate. I didn't realize. I just found these records. They're disturbing. What's going on here? Dr. Miller's face softened slightly, but there was a hardness in his tone. "You don't understand the full picture. These records are part of research that, while unconventional, is intended to advance our understanding of the human mind. It's crucial that you don't discuss what you've seen here." Before I could respond, he placed a hand on my shoulder, steering me towards the door. His grip was firm, and there was an unspoken warning in his eyes. "Let's keep this between us, for everyone's sake." The encounter left me shaken. I returned to my duties, but the image of the records and the photographs haunted me. The ethical boundaries had clearly been crossed, and the patients had become mere subjects in a disturbing experiment. The next few nights were filled with an oppressive silence as I grappled with the weight of what I had discovered. The thought of the patients who had suffered in silence under the guise of treatment gnawed at me. I began documenting everything I could, secretly recording details about the experiments and the unsettling circumstances surrounding the missing patient. Eventually, I found a way to alert the appropriate authorities without directly involving the hospital's administration. The investigation that followed was both relieving and heartbreaking. The truth about the experiments was brought to light, and several staff members, including Dr. Miller, faced legal consequences for their actions. The facility was subjected to intense scrutiny, and the patients were finally given the care and respect they deserved. The hidden room was sealed off, and the disturbing records were removed. But the memory of that night lingered, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can exist behind closed doors. The psychiatric hospital, once a place of routine and monotony, had revealed its hidden, sinister side, and I had become an unwilling witness to its grim reality. Story 27. During my summer internship at the Historical Research Center, I immersed myself in the dusty pages of bygone eras, meticulously cataloging documents and deciphering faded ink. It was a tedious but rewarding task, and I felt a sense of reverence for the past that echoed through the center's vast archives. It was during one of these long days of sorting through old manuscripts and forgotten letters that I stumbled upon something that would forever alter my understanding of history. The discovery happened almost by accident. I was organizing a box labeled Miscellaneous Correspondence 1920s when my fingers brushed against a stack of yellowing envelopes tucked behind a pile of less interesting documents. The envelopes were unmarked and appeared to have been deliberately concealed. Curiosity piqued, I carefully extracted them and began to examine their contents. The letters were dated between 1921 and 1929 and addressed to various recipients, all notable figures of the era. The handwriting was elegant but firm, and the language was formal, indicative of the high social standing of the correspondence. As I began to read, the initial impression of routine political discourse quickly faded, replaced by a chilling realization of something far more sinister. The first letter was addressed to a prominent banker known for his philanthropic efforts. The writer, whose identity was only signed off with a cryptic initial J, detailed a scheme involving illegal financial transactions and secret deals with influential politicians. The language was meticulous and carefully coded, but the implications were clear. This banker, once hailed as a benefactor, was deeply entrenched in a web of corruption and deceit. The subsequent letters expanded on this revelation. One detailed a clandestine meeting between this banker and a well-known politician, discussing plans to manipulate stock markets and evade taxes. Another letter exposed a secret society composed of powerful individuals whose activities were cloaked in secrecy and deception. The more I read, the more a pattern emerged. These prominent figures were involved in a vast conspiracy that spanned decades and reached into the highest echelons of society. One particularly disturbing letter described a covert operation in which these elites conspired to cover up a major scandal involving a series of high-profile disappearances. According to the letter, the victims were dissenters and political rivals who had been silenced to protect the interests of the conspiracy. The details were grim, recounting how these individuals were abducted and their fates concealed through a series of orchestrated disappearances. The deeper I delved into the letters, the more I realized the gravity of what I had uncovered. The correspondence, including influential figures in politics, finance, and industry, were not just involved in petty corruption, they were architects of a complex and horrifying scheme designed to manipulate society from behind the scenes. Each letter seemed to build on the revelations of the previous one, creating a disturbing narrative of deceit and control. The more I read, the more questions arose. Why had these letters been hidden away in the archives, and who had the foresight to preserve them? The letters were clearly meant to be kept secret, and their discovery could have explosive consequences. It was clear that the conspiracy had involved not just individuals, but an entire network of power and influence designed to remain hidden. I wrestled with the decision of what to do next. The Historical Research Center was my workplace, and I had a professional duty to preserve and present historical truths. But these letters contained information that went beyond historical interest. They hinted at a dark legacy of manipulation and malfeasance that spanned decades. Revealing such information could have far-reaching repercussions, not only for the reputations of the individuals involved, but for the understanding of history itself. After much deliberation, I decided to bring the discovery to my supervisor, a respected historian with decades of experience. I approached him with a mix of trepidation and determination, carefully laying out the letters and summarizing their contents. His initial reaction was one of skepticism, but as he read through the documents, his demeanor changed. He reviewed the letters with a grave expression, his eyes scanning the pages with a growing sense of urgency. "This is remarkable," he said slowly. "These documents could be groundbreaking, but they also pose significant risks. We need to handle this with extreme caution." We agreed to consult with legal experts and other historians to determine the best course of action. The process was slow and meticulous, involving layers of confidentiality and careful consideration. As the days turned into weeks, the significance of the letters continued to weigh heavily on my mind. The shadows of the past were not easily banished, and the knowledge of this hidden conspiracy gnawed at me. Eventually, the decision was made to publish the findings in a controlled manner, ensuring that the information was presented with the necessary context and sensitivity. The revelations were groundbreaking, exposing a web of corruption that had been hidden for decades. The response was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and outrage, as the public grappled with the implications of the uncovered conspiracy. The letters I had found were a window into a hidden world of power and deceit, a stark reminder that history is often more complex and darker than it appears on the surface. My internship had transformed into a journey of uncovering buried truths, and as I moved on to new endeavors, I carried with me the weight of the secrets I had unveiled and the responsibility of sharing them with the world. Story 28. The first package arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. I was just coming home from work, exhausted and looking forward to a quiet evening. The small, unmarked box was waiting for me on the doorstep. It was wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address or identifying marks. My curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully opened it, half expecting it to be a misplaced delivery or a harmless gift. Inside was a collection of items that immediately unsettled me. Among the contents was a faded photograph of me from a summer vacation years ago, a snapshot that I hadn't seen in ages. I recognized the location as a small beach town where I had spent a few days with friends. Next to the photograph was a small notebook filled with handwritten notes detailing my daily routine from that time, where I had gone, who I had met, and even snippets of conversations I'd had. The meticulous detail was alarming, but the most disturbing part was a handwritten note tucked into the package. It read, "I've been watching you for a long time. This is only the beginning." I stared at the note in disbelief, my heart pounding. I tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps it was a prank or a misguided attempt at humor, but the package's contents suggested otherwise. I placed everything back in the box, locked it away in a closet, and tried to put it out of my mind. The following week, another package arrived, and this time the contents were even more personal. Inside, I found an old ticket stub from a concert I'd attended years ago, along with a series of photographs taken during the event. I could see myself in the crowd, laughing and enjoying the show with my friends beside me. There was also a small, handwritten journal entry about my experiences that night, recounting details I'd long forgotten. The note accompanying this package read, "Your past is a map. I've been tracing your steps." The frequency of these packages increased, and each one seemed to delve deeper into my life. There was a box containing a keychain from a vacation I took with my family, a collection of old emails between me and a close friend, and even a video clip from a birthday party where I had blown out the candles on a cake. Each item was a reminder of moments I thought were private, moments that had been meticulously recorded and cataloged by someone with a disturbingly intimate knowledge of my life. The packages were always accompanied by a note, each message more menacing than the last. The note spoke of a plan, of a purpose, but they never gave away the full picture. They hinted at an elaborate scheme, but the true intentions remained shrouded in mystery. "You can't escape your past," read one note. "Every step you've taken has been observed," said another. The cryptic nature of the messages only heightened my anxiety. The stress began to take a toll on my daily life. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, unable to shake the feeling of being constantly watched. I stopped going out as frequently and became hyper-vigilant about my surroundings. I installed additional security measures, hoping to find some solace in knowing that I was taking steps to protect myself. But despite my efforts, the packages kept arriving, each one more disturbing than the last. One particularly unsettling package contained a box of old letters and cards I had received over the years. Among them was a letter from a college friend who had passed away, a card from a long-forgotten relative, and a note from an old boss praising my work. Each item was carefully preserved, and the sender seemed to take an unsettling pleasure in revisiting these personal connections. The note with this package read, "Every part of your life is part of the puzzle. I am putting it together, piece by piece." Desperate for answers, I turned to the authorities. I reported the packages, providing them with all the evidence I had gathered. The police took the matter seriously and launched an investigation, but progress was slow. They could see the pattern and understood the gravity of the situation, but finding the individual responsible was proving to be a significant challenge. The anonymity of the packages and the lack of concrete leads made it difficult for them to track down the sender. In the meantime, I felt isolated and paranoid. The constant reminders of my past were a psychological assault, and I struggled to maintain a sense of normalcy. The relentless barrage of personal details was wearing me down, and I began to question whether I had overlooked something or if I had unknowingly crossed paths with someone who now held a twisted fixation on me. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, the doorbell rang. I hesitated before answering, fearing another package or worse. When I opened the door, there was no one in sight. Instead, there was a large envelope on the doorstep. Trembling, I picked it up and took it inside. Inside the envelope were photographs and a series of documents, each one showcasing more recent events from my life, including detailed accounts of my work and social interactions. The final note in the envelope was chillingly direct. "You're in the final chapter now. The end is near." I felt a wave of panic wash over me. The sense of dread was overwhelming. Whoever was behind this had access to a frighteningly comprehensive record of my life, and the veiled threats suggested that their obsession was reaching a critical point. The knowledge that someone had been so thoroughly immersed in my personal history was deeply unsettling. I continued to cooperate with the police, providing them with the latest evidence and trying to stay vigilant. My life felt like it had been turned upside down, and the ongoing intrusion into my privacy left me in a state of constant fear. The packages had transformed from eerie reminders of the past into a looming threat that seemed to promise an unsettling conclusion. Every day was a battle to maintain a sense of control and normalcy, but the shadow of the anonymous stalker loomed ever larger. Each new package, each cryptic note, and each disturbing revelation only served to deepen the mystery and heighten my fear. The unsettling knowledge that someone had been so intimately involved in my life, cataloging every detail, left me with a profound sense of unease, and I could only hope that the investigation would eventually lead to answers and bring the disturbing chapter of my life to a close. Story 29. Working at the local animal shelter had been a dream come true for me. Ever since I was a child, I had wanted to work with animals, to help them and make a difference in their lives. The shelter was well regarded in the community for its compassionate care and dedication to animal welfare. However, my idealistic vision of the place was about to be shattered. My role was a mix of administrative tasks and hands-on care. I was responsible for updating animal records, coordinating adoptions, and assisting with daily care routines. Initially, everything seemed as perfect as I had imagined. The staff was friendly, the animals were lively, and the environment was welcoming. But as I settled into my position, I began to notice some irregularities that troubled me. It started with small things. Occasionally, animals would disappear without explanation. The staff would say they had been adopted or transferred, but there was a lack of paperwork to confirm these transfers. I initially chalked it up to administrative oversight or perhaps a result of the high volume of animals coming in and out of the shelter. One evening, while organizing the storage room, I stumbled upon a locked cabinet. It was an odd place for a storage unit tucked away behind a pile of old bedding and cleaning supplies. Curiosity got the better of me, and I found the key hidden in a drawer nearby. Inside, I discovered a collection of files and documents that seemed out of place. They were technical reports and data sheets that detailed various experimental procedures involving the animals. My heart sank as I read through the documents. They described procedures that were far from the humane care the shelter was supposed to provide. Instead, they outlined invasive experiments involving drug testing and behavioral manipulation. The reports were filled with clinical jargon, but the cruelty was evident. One document even listed specific animals by name, detailing the types of tests they had undergone and the results of those tests. I was horrified. The shelter had always presented itself as a place of refuge for animals, yet here was evidence of something deeply unethical happening behind the scenes. I tried to make sense of it, thinking that maybe these were outdated or misplaced documents, but the dates were current. The experiments were being conducted recently, under the guise of legitimate animal care. Desperate for answers, I confronted some of my colleagues. I started with Amy, a senior staff member who had always been kind to the animals and seemed genuinely devoted to their well-being. When I brought up the documents and expressed my concerns, she became visibly uncomfortable. Her response was vague, and she quickly changed the subject, offering me a nervous smile before walking away. Determined, I turned to Dr. Henderson, the shelter's head veterinarian. He was known for his expertise and seemed like someone who would be committed to ethical practices. I showed him the documents, hoping for an explanation or a way to address the situation. His reaction was alarmingly calm, almost dismissive. He assured me that the experiments were necessary for advancing veterinary science and that they were conducted with the utmost care and consideration. His words did little to reassure me. The idea of subjecting animals to experiments under the pretense of scientific advancement felt like a gross violation of their rights. I began to dig deeper, seeking information about the shelter's funding and any affiliations with research organizations. My search revealed that the shelter had partnerships with several pharmaceutical companies and academic institutions. The connections seemed to explain the nature of the experiments, but did little to ease my growing sense of unease. The more I uncovered, the more it became clear that the shelter's public image was a carefully constructed facade. Behind the scenes, it was involved in controversial research that prioritized scientific progress over animal welfare. I found evidence of financial incentives linked to these partnerships, grants and donations that came with conditions to continue the research and provide results. My attempts to bring the issue to light were met with increasing resistance. Whenever I tried to raise my concerns with higher management, I was met with vague assurances and pressure to keep quiet. I felt isolated and conflicted, torn between my desire to expose the truth and my fear of jeopardizing my job and my safety. Eventually, I made the difficult decision to go public. I gathered all the evidence I had collected, documents, photographs, and witness statements, and reached out to a local investigative journalist. It was a risky move, but I felt it was the only way to ensure that the truth about the shelter's activities was brought to light. The journalist was skeptical at first, but became convinced after reviewing the evidence. A series of articles were published, exposing the shelter's unethical practices and the dark side of its operations. The public outcry was swift and intense. Animal rights activists, community members, and former employees rallied together to demand accountability. The shelter's management was forced to address the scandal. The board of directors resigned, and an external investigation was launched. The shelter was shut down temporarily, and the animals were transferred to other facilities. The aftermath was chaotic, but it was also a crucial step toward holding those responsible accountable. In the end, my decision to expose the truth had far-reaching consequences. The shelter was restructured, with new leadership committed to genuine animal welfare. Although the process was arduous and fraught with challenges, I found solace in knowing that I had played a part in bringing about change. The experience left me with a profound understanding of the complexities and ethical dilemmas involved in animal care and research. It also reaffirmed my commitment to ensuring that any organization I worked for upheld the values of compassion and integrity. The shadow of that dark chapter would always linger, but it was a reminder of the importance of vigilance and the courage required to stand up for what is right. Story 30. When Rachel rented the old house for her summer project, she envisioned a serene retreat where she could work on her writing in peace. The house, nestled at the edge of a quaint village, seemed perfect for her needs. It was a charming Victorian-style home with creaky floorboards and ivy-clad walls, exuding an old-world charm that promised a quiet escape from her bustling city life. The first few days were spent settling in. Rachel unpacked her belongings, explored the property, and familiarized herself with the idiosyncrasies of the house. The attic and basement were particularly intriguing with their dusty, cobwebbed corners and forgotten relics. It was while organizing the attic that she stumbled upon something unexpected. At the back of a narrow, dimly lit corner of the attic, Rachel found a hidden door, partially concealed by a stack of old trunks and boxes. The door was made of heavy oak and had an ornate brass handle, which seemed oddly out of place given the rest of the attic's neglected appearance. Driven by curiosity, Rachel managed to pry open the door with a crowbar, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The basement below was unlike the rest of the house. It was meticulously organized but unnervingly cluttered. The room was filled with old recording equipment, photographs, and personal effects from previous tenants. The walls were lined with shelves holding an assortment of tapes, reels, and notebooks, all meticulously labeled and arranged. There was an eerie, almost oppressive atmosphere to the room, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for someone to uncover its secrets. Rachel's initial thrill of discovery quickly turned to unease as she began sifting through the items. She started with the recordings, which were labeled with dates and names. The recordings were chilling, consisting of conversations that ranged from mundane to disturbingly incoherent. Each tape seemed to document the lives of the house's previous occupants, but it was the nature of the content that was truly unsettling. The recordings revealed a pattern of obsessive behavior and increasing paranoia. One tape, dated several years prior, featured a man's frantic monologue about strange occurrences and unseen presences he spoke of being followed and watched, his voice growing more erratic with each passing minute. The recordings grew darker over time, with individuals describing feeling trapped and hunted. Some spoke of disappearing without warning, their voices filled with fear and desperation. The tapes seemed to capture not just the physical but also the psychological unraveling of those who had lived in the house. Among the personal effects were journals filled with frantic entries, photographs of people with their faces crossed out, and odd trinkets that seemed to have no obvious significance. One journal detailed a series of disturbing dreams involving shadowy figures and whispers in the night. The entries became increasingly paranoid, mentioning hidden cameras and feeling watched. Another journal had a series of dates marked with cryptic symbols and a notation about the endgame and the cycle closing. The photographs were the most unsettling. They depicted people who had lived in the house over the years, their faces often hidden or obscured. Some photos showed individuals with vacant expressions or in seemingly ordinary settings, but a closer look revealed something odd, strange reflections or shadows that didn't match the scene. As Rachel pieced together the evidence, a pattern began to emerge. The tenants seemed to be part of a continuous cycle of distress and disappearance. Each person who stayed in the house reported similar experiences, feelings of being watched, strange noises, and inexplicable events. The recordings hinted at a gradual but deliberate breakdown of the individual's mental states, leading to their ultimate vanishing. One recording, in particular, caught Rachel's attention. It was a late entry, recorded by someone who had clearly been in the house for a while. The individual spoke in hushed tones about the final ritual and mentioned preparing for a meeting. The recording ended abruptly, and the next tape was silent, as though it had been erased or had stopped working altogether. Rachel's growing dread was compounded by the fact that there were no records of the individuals who had disappeared. The house had a history of being rented out frequently, but no one seemed to know what had happened to the previous occupants. The local authorities had no records of disappearances connected to the house, and the village residents spoke of it with an air of detached indifference, as if the house were simply an old curiosity best left unexplored. Despite her fear, Rachel knew she had to delve deeper. She started investigating the village's history, seeking out old records and speaking to longtime residents. Many were reluctant to talk, their eyes clouded with a mix of fear and resignation. It seemed the house was the subject of whispered rumors and half-forgotten tales, its history shrouded in mystery. As the summer wore on, Rachel's sense of unease grew. She found herself drawn into the house's dark history, unable to escape the feeling that she was somehow part of the cycle. The once charming house had become a place of dread, and the more she uncovered, the more she felt trapped within its oppressive grasp. Rachel decided to leave the house earlier than planned, her sense of foreboding too strong to ignore. She packed her belongings and left with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The house stood silent behind her as she drove away, its secrets hidden once more. Yet as Rachel looked back, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching, waiting for the next person to uncover its dark history. The house remained, a silent witness to the unsettling events that had transpired within its walls, and Rachel's brief stay there became a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lingered just beneath the surface of everyday life. Story 31. Volunteering at the crisis hotline was something I had always wanted to do. The idea of offering support to those in need, providing a listening ear in moments of despair, felt profoundly meaningful. The training was rigorous, but it prepared us well for the emotional and psychological challenges we would face. I had quickly grown accustomed to the anonymous nature of the calls and the constant reminder that each call was a lifeline to someone in crisis. The calls were typically brief, a few minutes long, filled with the raw emotions of people reaching out in their darkest hours. Most of the time, I would end the call feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion, knowing I had made a small difference in someone's life. But then, things began to change. It started subtly. One evening, while answering calls, I received a message from someone who seemed unnervingly familiar with my life. They mentioned my college major, my favorite cafe, and even the details of a recent family gathering. At first, I brushed it off as a coincidence or an odd guess. After all, many people share similar details or have coincidental overlaps in their lives. But as the calls continued, the specificity of their knowledge grew more unsettling. The caller's voice was calm and measured, with an almost eerie sense of familiarity. They seemed to know not just general information but intimate details, my childhood memories, my struggles with anxiety, and even the dynamics of my family relationships. Each call left me with a growing sense of unease, as though I were being scrutinized by someone who had an unnerving obsession with my life. The persistence of the caller was alarming. They would call frequently, often at odd hours, and their conversations would always revolve around personal matters rather than the typical topics of crisis support. They would comment on recent events in my life, referencing things I had only discussed in private settings with close friends and family. It was as though they were stalking me through the very channels I used to offer help. The experience was both frightening and confusing. I knew the hotline was meant to provide anonymity for both callers and volunteers, but the level of detail this person had was beyond anything I had encountered before. I began to feel like my own safety was compromised, and the lines between my volunteer work and personal life were dangerously blurred. I discussed the situation with my supervisor, explaining my concerns and the strange details the caller had shared. She listened attentively and took the matter seriously. We reviewed the call logs and found that the calls had been made from various numbers, all of which were untraceable. The anonymity of the hotline was both a blessing and a curse in this situation. It protected the privacy of those seeking help, but also shielded the identity of someone who could potentially be dangerous. My supervisor suggested we implement additional security measures. I was advised to limit the personal information I shared during calls and to be extra vigilant. The organization also began monitoring calls more closely, though they were limited in how they could track anonymous interactions. Despite these measures, the calls continued. Each time, the caller seemed to grow more bold, discussing new aspects of my life and offering disturbing insights. It became clear that their knowledge was not coincidental but meticulously gathered. They mentioned details I had never publicly shared, such as my part-time job, my interactions with certain people, and even private thoughts I had shared with a few close friends. Their insights into my life felt like a grotesque invasion of my privacy. One evening, after a particularly unsettling call, I decided to take more drastic action. I contacted the police, sharing everything I knew about the calls and the disturbing details the caller had disclosed. The officers took the situation seriously, but the anonymity of the calls posed significant challenges for their investigation. They began by tracing the numbers used to make the calls, though they faced hurdles due to the use of burner phones and anonymizing services. In the meantime, the psychological toll on me was mounting. I found it increasingly difficult to separate my role as a volunteer from the encroaching sense of personal threat. The crisis hotline, once a sanctuary where I could offer solace to others, had become a source of fear and anxiety. I worried constantly about whether the caller would escalate their behavior or if they had access to even more personal information. Despite the police's efforts, the identity of the caller remained elusive. They continued to call, but the frequency gradually diminished over time. It was as though the caller had achieved what they intended, to instill fear and uncertainty before retreating back into the shadows. The experience left me deeply shaken and more aware of the vulnerabilities that come with anonymity, both for those seeking help and those providing it. I continued my work at the hotline with a heightened sense of vigilance and a renewed commitment to protecting both myself and those I aimed to help. The unsettling knowledge that someone had so intimately invaded my privacy lingered, but I took solace in the fact that the calls eventually stopped. Though the investigation did not lead to concrete answers, it served as a reminder of the importance of safeguarding personal boundaries and maintaining vigilance in the face of potential threats. In the end, the experience was a stark reminder of the complexities and dangers that can arise even in the most well-intentioned endeavors. It taught me valuable lessons about the intersection of personal safety and professional responsibility, and the importance of vigilance in a world where anonymity can both protect and endanger. Story 32. Cleaning out my grandparents' house was a daunting task, not just because of the sheer volume of belongings amassed over decades, but because of the emotional weight that came with it. The house itself, a sprawling old Victorian with creaky wooden floors and a musty scent, felt like it held its own secrets. While sifting through dusty boxes in the attic, I stumbled upon an old leather-bound diary, its cover cracked and faded. The diary belonged to my grandmother, Evelyn, whose quiet, unassuming demeanor had always belied the mysteries hidden within the walls of her home. I had never known her to be one for writing, so finding this diary was unexpected. Driven by curiosity and a sense of reverence, I decided to read it, hoping to uncover more about her life. The diary opened with mundane entries about daily life, the weather, chores, and brief observations about family events. But as I read further, I noticed a change in tone. The entries began to describe interactions with the neighbors, descriptions that seemed oddly charged with tension and unease. One entry from the spring of 1972 stood out. Evelyn wrote about a seemingly innocent encounter with the Williams family, who had recently moved into the house across the street. She described Mrs. Williams as a friendly, if somewhat reserved, woman who had come over to introduce herself. Evelyn noted that Mrs. Williams seemed nervous and frequently glanced over her shoulder, as if wary of being followed. As the weeks went by, Evelyn's entries became increasingly cryptic. She mentioned odd occurrences, strange noises coming from the Williams house late at night, and frequent visitors who were never seen entering or leaving the home. One entry, dated several months later, was particularly chilling. Evelyn wrote about an unsettling conversation she had overheard between Mr. Williams and a man she didn't recognize. The discussion was heated and filled with obscure references to the arrangement and keeping it hidden. Evelyn's observations were detailed but often vague, hinting at a larger, darker secret that she could never fully articulate. The diary entries mentioned other neighbors who seemed unusually interested in the Williams family. There was talk of late-night meetings and hurried exchanges, all of which Evelyn witnessed from her window but never fully understood. As I continued reading, the entries grew more troubling. In one, Evelyn described an eerie event that took place in the dead of night. She wrote about seeing a shadowy figure sneaking out of the Williams house and slipping into a hidden entrance in the back of the property. The figure carried a large, heavy-looking bag. Evelyn's fear was palpable as she wrote about how she felt compelled to investigate but was too frightened to confront the situation directly. The diary also included a series of notes about strange symbols that Evelyn had seen scrawled on the walls of the Williams basement during one of her brief, accidental glimpses through a partially open window. These symbols were described in detail, but Evelyn had no idea what they meant. Her descriptions of the symbols were detailed enough to suggest a serious and possibly occult significance. In the months following these entries, Evelyn's tone became increasingly anxious. She wrote about her growing sense of paranoia, feeling as though she was being watched or followed whenever she ventured out. The diary entries mentioned encounters with the Williams family that were fraught with tension, Mrs. Williams' evasive answers to questions, and Mr. Williams' cold stares that seemed to carry a warning. The final entries in the diary were written in a hurried scrawl, and they described a particularly harrowing event. Evelyn recounted a strange incident where her house was broken into. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, but the diary mentioned that it seemed like someone had been searching for something specific. Evelyn was terrified and wrote that she felt she was in grave danger. Her final entry was a desperate plea for someone to understand the truth she had uncovered and to protect her from whatever was threatening her. As I finished reading the diary, a heavy silence settled over me. The entries had revealed a web of intrigue and fear that I had never suspected existed within the seemingly peaceful neighborhood. The Williams family had vanished from the area shortly after Evelyn's last entry, and their disappearance was never explained. I had always heard whispers about their sudden departure, but the details in the diary painted a far more sinister picture. Driven by a mix of dread and curiosity, I decided to investigate further. I reached out to local historians and old-time residents who might remember the Williams family and any peculiar events surrounding their time in the neighborhood. What I discovered only deepened the mystery. It appeared that the Williams family had been involved in local gossip about strange occurrences and secretive activities, but no one had concrete answers. The most unsettling part of my investigation was discovering that the house they had lived in had been torn down shortly after they left, and the lot had been sold to a new owner. The new owner, it seemed, had also experienced unexplained phenomena and had quickly moved out, leaving the property to fall into disrepair. The more I uncovered, the more I felt that Evelyn had stumbled upon something far darker than she could have imagined, a secret that had likely driven the Williams family away and left a mark of fear on everyone who came into contact with it. The diary had provided a glimpse into a world of shadows and hidden truths, and though the full extent of the secret remained elusive, it was clear that Evelyn had been a silent witness to something profoundly disturbing. Story 33. The assignment seemed routine enough to cover a string of burglaries in the small town of Riverview. As a journalist with a knack for uncovering the truth, I was accustomed to reporting on petty crimes and community issues. This time, however, the story took a turn that would lead me into the dark, hidden underbelly of the town, a network involved in human trafficking that was operating right under the community's nose. It all started on a chilly autumn evening, when I was assigned to cover a series of break-ins in the more affluent part of town. Riverview was known for its quiet streets and neighborly charm, but the recent rash of burglaries had unsettled the community. As I interviewed locals and sifted through police reports, I stumbled upon a peculiar detail. One of the burglary victims, a woman named Linda Marsh, had reported that some of her belongings had been missing but not stolen. Instead, she claimed that items had been carefully moved around her house, almost as if someone had been searching for something specific. Linda's house was a lavish affair, filled with antiques and family heirlooms. The police had chalked up the incident to an eccentric burglar with a taste for the unusual. However, something about Linda's account struck me as odd. During my interview, she mentioned a recent influx of new, strange faces around town, particularly near the edges of the community. I noted this down, thinking it might be an unrelated detail, but it lingered in my mind. My investigation into the burglaries led me to several other cases where similar patterns emerged: items moved around but not taken, and a growing number of reports of unfamiliar people in the vicinity. It seemed like a string of coincidences until I received an anonymous tip from a source who claimed to have information about something much darker happening in Riverview. The tip was cryptic, mentioning a warehouse on the outskirts of town and a secret that shouldn't be ignored. The source didn't provide much else, but I felt a shiver of excitement and apprehension. Intrigued and determined to follow up, I decided to investigate the warehouse mentioned in the tip. The warehouse was located on the edge of town, away from the main residential areas. It was a rundown building, its windows boarded up and the exterior covered in grime and neglect. From the outside, it looked like an old industrial relic, but something about its desolation seemed to resonate with the uneasy feeling I had been carrying. I approached the building cautiously, trying to peer through the grimy windows. Inside, I saw piles of discarded furniture and boxes, but nothing that immediately stood out as suspicious. I returned to my car, planning my next move, when I noticed something odd: a small, rusted door at the back of the building that seemed to have been recently disturbed. It was slightly ajar, as if someone had left it open in a hurry. That night, I returned with a flashlight and a camera. I managed to pry open the door and slip inside, moving quietly through the dim, musty interior. The warehouse was filled with abandoned items, but as I ventured further, I discovered a hidden door leading to a basement. The door was locked, but a quick look around the warehouse yielded a rusty crowbar that made it easy to force it open. The basement was a grim revelation. The walls were lined with surveillance monitors showing various locations around town, including some that were disturbingly close to the homes of the burglary victims I had interviewed. But the most chilling discovery was a series of documents spread across a table files detailing the names and addresses of several young women who had recently gone missing from the area. The documents were disturbing. Each file contained photographs and personal details about the women, along with what appeared to be coded instructions and schedules. There were also references to a network of contacts, with names and numbers that pointed to a larger, organized effort. It became painfully clear that this was not just a series of random crimes, but rather a coordinated effort involving human trafficking. My heart raced as I photographed the evidence and took careful notes. It was clear that the warehouse was a hub for something far more sinister than petty theft. I had uncovered a network that preyed on the vulnerable, operating in secrecy while the community remained oblivious. In the days that followed, I meticulously verified the information I had gathered. I cross-referenced the names and addresses from the documents with missing persons reports and connected the dots between the surveillance footage and the profiles of the missing individuals. It became increasingly evident that the network was using the warehouse as a base of operations for trafficking individuals, likely moving them through hidden channels and exploiting them for profit. Armed with this information, I reached out to trusted law enforcement contacts, providing them with the evidence I had collected. I knew that exposing this network required careful coordination to avoid alerting those involved and to ensure the safety of the victims. The police conducted a series of raids on the warehouse and other locations identified in the documents, leading to the arrest of several individuals and the dismantling of the trafficking network. The story I published shook Riverview to its core. The revelation of such a dark operation hidden within the seemingly safe community caused widespread outrage and disbelief. The investigation not only brought justice for the victims, but also highlighted the importance of vigilance and the need for communities to address the hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface. As I reflected on the case, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. I had uncovered a disturbing truth and played a part in bringing an end to a terrible crime, but the impact on the victims and their families was a somber reminder of the darkness that can exist within even the most unsuspecting places. The warehouse, now shut down and abandoned, stood as a stark reminder of the secrets that can lurk just out of sight, waiting to be uncovered. Story 34. When I first bought the old Victorian house on Maple Lane, it felt like a dream come true. The place had character-ornate woodwork, stained glass windows, and a sprawling attic that seemed like the perfect space for a creative studio. The house had been empty for a while, and despite its age, I saw endless potential in its dusty corners and creaky floors. Little did I know, this charming house would become the setting for a nightmare. The initial months were spent settling in, unpacking boxes, and making the space my own. Everything was as expected until the first signs of something amiss began to appear. It started with small, innocuous incidents: a misplaced book, a mug that wasn't where I remembered leaving it, and odd, faint noises coming from the attic. I attributed these to the house settling or my own forgetfulness. But as time went on, the occurrences grew more frequent and unsettling. Objects would move around in ways that defied logic, and the noises from the attic became more pronounced: soft rustlings, creaking boards, and sometimes even what sounded like footsteps. I tried to rationalize it as the house's quirks or perhaps my imagination running wild, but the feeling of unease persisted. One night, after a particularly disturbing encounter where I found my kitchen utensils rearranged in a pattern that seemed deliberate, I decided to take action. I installed a few security cameras around the house, focusing primarily on the areas where I had noticed the strange noises. My goal was to capture anything that might explain the disturbances. The first few days of monitoring yielded nothing. I found nothing but the usual empty house scenes, with no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. My anxiety started to wane, and I began to think I had been overreacting. Then, one morning I reviewed the footage from the previous night and was stunned by what I saw. The camera in the hallway leading to the attic had recorded movement during the early hours of the morning. At first the footage seemed normal, just the house settling. But then, a shadow appeared on the screen, moving quickly and deliberately. I zoomed in on the footage, and to my horror I saw a figure emerging from the attic. The person moved with a practiced ease, blending into the shadows, and was soon out of the frame. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I watched the footage over and over, trying to make sense of it. The figure was elusive, their face hidden, but the movement was unmistakable. Someone had been in the attic and had come down during the night. I began to piece together the implications. The noises, the misplaced items, the feeling of being watched, everything suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense. I decided to confront the situation head-on. I checked the attic door and, to my surprise, found it slightly ajar. I had always kept it securely closed, so the fact that it was open was deeply unsettling. I took a deep breath and slowly ascended the creaky stairs to the attic. The attic was as I remembered it, filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs. But as I scanned the space, I noticed something chilling. A small, hidden alcove that I had previously overlooked was now slightly disturbed. The dust was disturbed, and there were traces of recent activity. I couldn't see anyone or anything, but the feeling of dread was palpable. I took more footage from the attic, carefully documenting everything. I searched for any clues that might reveal who had been living there. It was then that I found a series of personal items: an old blanket, a few cans of food, and some basic toiletries. Someone had been using this space as a temporary home. The discovery was both terrifying and revolting. The next step was to contact the authorities. I provided them with the footage and the evidence from the attic. The police conducted an investigation, but the intruder had vanished by the time they arrived. There were no fingerprints or clear signs of entry, which made the case difficult to solve. In the weeks that followed, I took extra precautions. I had the locks changed, installed additional security measures, and made sure that all entry points to the attic were secured. I also continued to monitor the cameras, hoping to catch any further disturbances. The experience had a profound effect on me. I became hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the house, and I struggled to feel safe in my own home. The knowledge that someone had been secretly living in my attic and tracking my movements was a violation that was difficult to shake off. Even as the days passed and no new evidence emerged, the sense of invasion remained. The house itself began to feel different. What was once a charming Victorian now seemed to hold an air of menace. I could no longer look at the attic with the same sense of potential. Instead, it was a reminder of the unsettling events that had unfolded. Eventually, the police were able to identify a suspect, an individual with a history of similar intrusions. They had managed to gain access to the house through an old service entry point that had been overlooked during renovations. The suspect was apprehended, but the damage to my sense of security had been done. Though I continued living in the house, the incident left a mark on me. I learned to live with the lingering discomfort, finding solace in the knowledge that I had taken steps to protect myself. The attic remained locked and unused, a grim reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk in the most unsuspecting places. Story 35. The laboratory was situated in a remote location, nestled between dense forests and craggy hills that seemed to stretch endlessly. Its isolation was a deliberate choice, meant to keep prying eyes at bay. I had been recruited as a researcher with the promise of working on groundbreaking advancements in biotechnology. The work was demanding but fascinating, involving complex experiments and long hours. I was part of a small team that prided itself on pushing the boundaries of scientific knowledge. However, the isolation and secrecy of the lab often felt stifling, and the atmosphere was tinged with an unspoken tension. One evening, while reviewing a batch of experimental data, I stumbled upon a set of files that seemed oddly out of place. They were buried deep in a subdirectory labeled Confidential Project X. The title alone piqued my curiosity, but it was the file names that set my nerves on edge: unethical procedures, subject responses, and unauthorized protocols. My curiosity got the better of me. I began to dig into the files, initially expecting to find procedural errors or documentation about rejected experiments. Instead, what I uncovered was deeply unsettling. The documents detailed a series of experiments conducted on unsuspecting individuals, many of whom were described in chilling terms. These subjects were not volunteers but were instead selected without their knowledge or consent. The experiments were performed under the guise of legitimate research, but the protocols described in the files were far from ethical. One document outlined a series of psychological and physiological experiments that were conducted on individuals who had been deemed socially expendable: homeless people, transient workers, and those without strong social networks. The experiments were described in horrifying detail. Subjects were exposed to extreme conditions, both mental and physical, and subjected to invasive procedures intended to measure their responses under duress. As I continued reading, the depth of the depravity became more apparent. One file described the use of experimental drugs designed to alter mood and perception, administered without any regard for the subject's well-being. Another detailed methods of psychological manipulation aimed at breaking down the subject's sense of self. The experiments were justified under the guise of advancing scientific understanding, but the disregard for human dignity was palpable. The documentation included not only the procedures but also detailed notes on the subject's reactions, health declines, and eventual outcomes. Many of the subjects were reported to have suffered severe psychological trauma, while others had deteriorated physically. The files included photographs and personal details that made the horror of the situation even more visceral. The lab had meticulously recorded their suffering as part of the so-called research. My heart raced as I processed the gravity of what I had discovered. The reality that this research, which I had previously regarded as legitimate and innovative, was deeply compromised by unethical practices was overwhelming. The isolation of the lab suddenly took on a more sinister meaning. It was clear that the remote location served to shield these atrocities from the scrutiny of the outside world. As I read through the files, a sense of dread settled over me. The lab was conducting illegal and immoral experiments, and I was now in possession of evidence that could expose these horrors. The ethical dilemma was profound. Reporting the findings could bring the lab's activities to light, but it also risked endangering my own safety and possibly implicating myself in the process. I decided to confront the issue head-on. The first step was to gather evidence and ensure that I had a thorough understanding of the extent of the unethical practices. I meticulously compiled the documents and photographs into a secure, encrypted file. My next move was to plan how to reveal this information while safeguarding myself from potential retribution. The atmosphere at the lab grew increasingly tense as I prepared to act. The usual camaraderie among the researchers was replaced by an air of suspicion and unease. I could sense that something was amiss. but I had no way of knowing if the others were aware of the unethical practices or if the growing tension was merely a result of the lab's isolated nature. One night, I made the decision to reach out to an investigative journalist known for exposing scientific misconduct. I crafted a detailed report, attaching the evidence I had uncovered, and sent it anonymously. The journalist was known for their thorough work and had previously taken down unethical research institutions. I hoped that by exposing the lab I could prevent further suffering and ensure that those responsible faced justice. Days turned into weeks, and the silence from the outside world was deafening. I was consumed by a mix of fear and anticipation, wondering if my actions had made any impact. The lab's operations continued as usual, but I noticed subtle changes: a heightened security presence, increased scrutiny of employees, and a palpable tension in the air. Then, one morning, a team of external investigators arrived at the lab. They conducted a thorough inspection, interviewing staff and examining the facilities. The tension among the lab's personnel was palpable, and I could see the fear in their eyes as they tried to navigate the investigation. Eventually, the truth about the lab's unethical experiments came to light. The exposure led to a broader investigation into similar practices at other institutions. The lab was shut down and several individuals were held accountable for their actions. The experience left an indelible mark on me. The isolation and secrecy that once felt stifling now seemed like a metaphor for the darkness that had been hidden within. I had uncovered a horrifying reality and taken steps to ensure that justice was served, but the experience had forever altered my perspective on the ethical boundaries of scientific research.